The Combing's charts died at 0347 ship time. Deka had been watching them thin for 3 days. The notation markers, little angular stamps that the Combing placed at intervals, the way a surveyor might plant flags across a continent, had been growing sparser since they crossed the avoidance boundary Pakla identified back in the open space crossing. For the first 2 days past the line, there were still markers. Old ones, degraded data stamps whose formatting didn't match the current Combine standard, their edge characters warranted noise by however many centuries of database migration. Ghost flags. Someone had been out here once and planted their little angular stamps and then stopped coming back. Now there was nothing. Deka sat at the sensor console on the Arveth bridge, a console she had rebuilt twice in the past 6 days, peeling off interface panels to reroute display logic until the readout showed her what she actually needed instead of what a Combine freight operator was supposed to see, and watched the last notation marker drift off the trailing edge of the nav display. Behind it, data. Ahead of it, blank. The distinction mattered. Blank was not empty. She had worked with blank maps before. In the field outside Mogadishu, her NGO team had operated from satellite imagery that simply stopped at certain district borders. The imagery provider had decided not to look. The ground was still there. The people were still there. The map just chose not to see them. The Combine blink charted this because they had nothing to put here, she thought, watching the empty display scroll forward into uncharted space. I have been in places that got blink charted because people decided not to know what was in them. Those two blank spaces feel different. This one feels like the second kind. The bridge was quiet. Quintus's watch rotation had settled into a rhythm over the past week that Deka still found mildly miraculous. A Roman centurion organizing schedules for a crew that included a Norse raider, a Mexica warrior, a Comanche scout, a Romani healer, a Sengoku-era infiltrator, 3 aliens who communicated on channels humans couldn't fully perceive, an alien captain who had traded his cooperation for the dignified title of operational consultant, and 600 souls in the holds who were still learning that the locks on their doors didn't engage anymore. The rotation worked. That was the thing about Quintus. He didn't need to understand a person to deploy them correctly. He just needed to see what they were good at. Deka was good at this. The watching, the recording, the refusing to look away. She pulled up the sensor log she'd been building since they crossed the boundary and checked her methodology. Raw instrument feeds on the left to display her manual annotations on a flat panel she'd detached from a secondary console and propped against the wall beside her station, its surface covered in stylus marks, a combination of Somali shorthand, English abbreviations, and the 30-odd Kambe notation symbols she'd memorized from the freight database. The Combine's instruments were designed to categorize things. They were very good at categorizing things the Combine had already seen. They were useless for this. She was staring at the blank chart when the first anomaly appeared. It arrived without announcement. The Combine systems had very specific protocols for unknown contacts, escalating alert hierarchies, color-coded threat displays, automated flagging to the command console. None of that activated. Instead, the long-range passive array returned a reading that just sat there. Deka saw it in the background noise of the sensor sweep, a density variation at the outer edge of detection range, about 11 hours ahead at current speed. The instruments measured it, dutifully logged it, and then did nothing with it. No classification, no threat flag, no alert, because the reading didn't match any Combine category. She leaned in. The density profile was wrong, and wrong in a way she could distinguish from sensor noise or instrument degradation. She'd become intimate with both over the past 2 weeks and could read their textures the way Pakla read wind. This was a clean reading. The instruments were functioning perfectly. They were just returning data that the Combine's classification system had no bucket for. The density variation implied something there. Something occupying space. But the displacement profile, The way it interacted with the ambient particle medium around it didn't read like matter. Matter pushed things out of the way. This was more like a presence that coexisted with the space it was in without shouldering anything aside. Deka pulled up a blank annotation field on her propped panel and wrote the first entry, 0351, Anomaly 1, Designation Presence. Instrument profile implies something occupying space without displacing it the way matter should. Clean read, not noise. No combine classification match. Distance 11.2 hours at current heading. She was about to start a second pass when the density profile shifted, a fractional change in orientation, as though whatever was out there had adjusted its angle very slightly. She checked the Arvith's heading. No change. She checked the sensor sweep timing. The shift in the anomaly had occurred precisely 1.7 seconds after the Arvith's passive array had swept across its position. It had moved when they looked at it. Deka felt something she hadn't felt since the first time she'd opened the synthesis matrix and found 41 dormant parameters waiting to be unlocked. Curiosity with adrenaline in it. The pleasure of encountering a system she didn't understand and knowing she was about to start understanding it. She wrote the second entry, 0354, Anomaly 2, Designation Attention, same density profile as presence but with responsive orientation shift, timed 1.7 seconds after sensor sweep contact. It moved when we moved. Implication awareness of our approach. Intent unclear. I am naming things, she thought, and smiled despite the circumstances. I call this one presence because the instrument profile implies something occupying space without displacing it the way matter should. I call this one attention because it moved when we moved. I am making up a science in real time, and it is the most interesting thing I have done in 2 weeks. Over the next 40 minutes, 3 more anomalies appeared. Presence-type readings at different ranges and vectors, distributed in a loose pattern around the Arvith's projected heading. And she wrote this down too, hating the analogy even as she recognized its accuracy. Sentinels standing at intervals along a road, watching a traveler approach. None of them flagged any Combine alert protocol. None of them matched any Combine database entry. All of them adjusted their orientation within 2 seconds of the Arvith's passive array sweeping across them. The space ahead was inhabited. Whatever lived here did not exist in the Combine's categories. And it was watching. The first course correction happened at 0512. Deka almost missed it. She had been cross-referencing her attention readings against the Arvith's navigation log, looking for patterns in the intervals between the anomalies when the heading indicator twitched. A tiny shift, the kind of micro-adjustment the autopilot made routinely to compensate for particle density variations or gravitational drift. She wouldn't have noticed it at all, except that she'd stripped the autopilot's destination parameters 3 days ago. The autopilot didn't have a destination. She had never given it one. Pakla had set the heading manually, a compass bearing into the blank, aimed at the heart of the avoided cluster based on the old Combine markers that went in and never came out. The autopilot was maintaining that heading, not navigating toward a point. There was no point to navigate toward, and yet the heading had shifted by 0.3 degrees starboard. The autopilot log recorded the adjustment as a standard drift correction, but there was no drift to correct. The particle density ahead was uniform. The gravitational field was stable. The Arvith had no reason to adjust, and no one had told it to. Deka sat very still, staring at the correction in the navigation log. Then she pulled up the internal systems diagnostic and started running through the autopilot's decision tree. The correction was clean, properly formatted, logged with a valid timestamp and a standard correction code. It looked exactly like a routine adjustment. It was not a routine adjustment. She flagged it in her annotation log and kept watching. The second correction came 41 minutes later. Another 0.3 degrees, same direction, same formatting, same standard code, same absence of any actual drift that needed correcting. Deka watched it happen this time. She saw the heading indicator move. She saw the autopilot log the adjustment. She saw the correction code populate the record as if the system had simply done what systems do. She put her hand on the manual override. Her fingers rested on the cool composite surface, a slightly different texture than earth plastic, more like ceramic with give in it, and she held them there while the seconds stretched. If she engaged the override, she could reject the correction. Lock the heading. Restore Pakla's original bearing. The 0.6 degree difference between Pakla's heading and the corrected one was negligible in absolute terms. At this distance from the cluster's center, it changed their approach vector by a margin that would matter only if there was something specific to approach. If there was a door and the corrections were aiming them at it, or it was a system malfunction and she was reading intention into noise because she was exhausted and jumping at shadows, she did not engage the override. She took her hand away, placed it in her lap, and wrote 0553. Course correction 2. Heading adjusted 0.6 degrees cumulative starboard from Pakla's original bearing. No drift to correct. No destination in autopilot. The ship is being steered by something that is not me and is not the autopilot's programming. Corrections are gentle, gradual, like someone leading a horse by walking in front of it rather than pulling the reins. The third correction came 93 minutes later. She was ready for it. She watched every system on her rebuilt console as it happened. This time she saw something she'd missed before. The correction initiated from the communications array, not the navigation system. A signal came in too faint and too brief for the standard comms log to flag, and the autopilot responded to it as if it were a navigational beacon. The Arvith systems were acknowledging a signal she hadn't authorized them to acknowledge. Whatever was out there was talking to the ship in the ship's own language, and the ship was listening. Deka got up from her console. She found Quintus on the command deck, which was what they'd started calling the raised platform at the back of the bridge where the captain's operational station sat. Quintus was not sitting at the station. He was standing beside it, arms crossed, watching the main display with the same expression he brought to everything, calm assessment with iron underneath. The overhead fixtures cast their sodium orange light across his face, catching the line of his jaw, the close-cropped hair that was growing out unevenly because alien grooming tools didn't work the way Roman ones did, and the dull gleam of the iron service ring he still wore. The ship just corrected our heading by 0.3 degrees, Deka said. I didn't do it. Pakla didn't do it. The autopilot doesn't have a destination to aim for. I never gave it one. Quintus didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had learned decades ago that the universe would continue producing situations that required assessment regardless of whether he was ready for them. And many times, he asked. 3, over 4 hours, each one small, each one bringing us slightly starboard of Pakla's heading. She paused, organizing the information the way she'd learned he preferred it. Relevant facts first, interpretation second, uncertainty flagged clearly. The corrections are coming through the communications array. Something ahead is sending a signal the Arvith systems recognize as a navigational beacon. I don't know how. The signal isn't formatted like any Combine nav beacon I've seen, but the ship is treating it as one. Toward what? I don't know yet. The heading adjustment puts us on a slightly different approach vector into the cluster. But whether that's pointing us at something specific, I can't tell from here. Quintus looked at her for a long moment. The sodium orange light made shadows of the hollows under his eyes. None of them were sleeping well. None of them had slept well since the cells, if she was being honest. But Quintus carried his exhaustion the way he carried everything, as weight distributed evenly across both shoulders, acknowledged and managed and never complained about. Are we being warned off? He asked. The relevant military question. The first question a man with 30 years of frontier service would ask, because the answer determined everything that came next. If the corrections were pushing them away, they were entering contested territory and needed to decide whether to force the issue. If they were being pulled in, Deka shook her head. No, I think we're being checked. Awadnaid, Data and swinging. A warning pushes you away or puts something between you and the destination. An intercept vector, a weapons lock, a boundary marker. These corrections aren't pushing us away from the cluster. They're adjusting our approach to it, more precisely, towards something specific inside it. And the sensor anomalies I've been tracking for the past 3 hours aren't moving to block us. They're standing along our heading at intervals, watching us come. She hesitated, then added, in the field, when a community wanted to see you before they decided whether to shoot you or offer you tea, they sent someone to walk alongside the road you were coming in on. To look at you, that's what this feels like. Quintus absorbed this. He was good at that, taking information from a framework he didn't share and extracting the tactical content without needing the cultural context explained. Then we continue, he said, but I want you on that console until we arrive. Everything that happens, I want recorded. Already doing it. The ghost of approval crossed his face. On Quintus, that was practically a standing ovation. Good. The scan happened at 0804. Deka was back at her console, her propped panel now covered with 3 columns of annotations, presence readings, attention readings, and the new category she'd labeled architecture, readings that suggested structures in the spatial medium ahead that were not planets, not ships, not stations, but something else. Patterns in the background radiation that were too regular to be natural and too distributed to be constructed in any way she understood. She was writing Architecture 3, lattice pattern and ambient particle distribution consistent with shaped gravitational field, but without detectable mass source when her instruments stuttered. Every readout on her rebuilt console flickered simultaneously, a half-second dropout that washed the display clear and then brought it back, and when it came back, every reading was the same as before, except that something new was passing through the sensor field. It came from ahead, from the cluster. It washed through the Arvith like weather, like a warm front moving across a plain, felt before it was measured. Deka watched her instruments register it and try to classify it and fail. The scan, because that was what it was, she was certain of it by the second, was not electromagnetic. It was not gravitational. It was not any propagation medium in the Combine's physics database. The instruments measured its passage the way a seismograph measures a tremor. They could tell you something happened and how big it was and how long it lasted, but they could not tell you what it was. It was thorough. She watched it move through the ship on her sensor readout, layer by layer, hull first, then the space between the outer and inner walls, then the interior compartments. She could track its progress by the way her instruments responded to its passage. Each system it touched flickered in the same half-second dropout pattern, and then came back clean, as if it had been read and returned. It felt gentle. That was the wrong word, scientifically. Scans didn't have feelings. But Deka had been through Combine scans, the freight standard ones that the slaver ran during their captivity, calibrated to assess body mass and metabolic output and nothing else, as clinical and indifferent as a barcode reader. Those scans felt like being measured. This scan felt like being looked at by someone who understood the intrusion and was trying to do it carefully. She put her hand on the override. The scan passed through her console. She felt nothing. Her hands registered no vibration, no temperature change, no sensation at all. But every display on the console blinked and came back, and when it came back, her annotation panel was still propped against the wall, with all her handwritten notes intact, and the scan had not touched it, had passed around it, as if it recognized that the panel was her personal record and chose not to read it. She didn't engage the override. Her hand rested on the surface, and the scan continued, and she watched it sweep through the Arveth's bridge with patient thoroughness. 4 minutes, then it stopped. The instrument settled. Every readout returned to normal. The bridge was quiet, sodium orange, and humming exactly as it had been. Except, on the nav display, at the extreme edge of detection range, a new indicator had appeared. It was faint, almost below the display threshold. a marker that the Combine systems had tentatively classified as a surface settlement based on the density and thermal profile, even though the classification didn't fit the data any better than anything else had fit the data today. A planet in the cluster with something on its surface that was not a Combine outpost, not a natural formation, and not anything in the database. The corrected heading, the one the Arveth had been gently, carefully steered toward over the past 5 hours, pointed directly at it. Deka wrote 0808, scan complete, duration 4 minutes, medium unknown, behavior non-invasive, thorough, possibly selective, avoided personal annotation panel, coincidence or intent unknown, result, one new indicator on nav display, settlement, surface of a planet in the cluster. We have been steered toward it. We are spected, she called Quintus back. She told him about the scan. She told him about the new indicator. She told him about the heading and the way it pointed at the settlement like an arrow. Quintus asked, weapons profile? None. Intercept heading? None. Intercept heading? None. Nothing is moving toward us. Nothing has been moving toward us this entire time. Everything I've tracked has been stationary or nearly so, watching, not approaching. Could it be a trap? Draw us in, close behind it. Could be. I can't rule it out with the instruments I have. But the scan was Siadatis. She paused, looking for the right word. Careful. Whatever did that was trying not to alarm us. If you're setting a trap, you don't usually care whether the thing you're trapping feels comfortable. Quintus turned to look at the nav display. The settlement indicator glowed at the edge, faint and patient. Time to arrival? At current speed, about 7 hours. The orbital approach will take longer if we want to observe before committing. We want to observe. He was quiet for a moment. Then, wake Pakla. I want her reading whatever we can see of the surface from orbit before we get any closer. Tatada nodded and turned back to her console to record the order. That was when she heard the signal. It was in the background of the communications array, a frequency she had never seen used, buried below the standard channels the Combine reserved for operational traffic. It had been there for, she checked the log, 11 minutes. The array had been receiving it since the scan ended, and because it didn't match any Combine communication protocol, it had been routed to the passive monitoring buffer without flagging. Deka pulled it up. The signal was simple, repeating, a structured pattern too complex to be noise, too sparse to be a message in any language she recognized, a few syllables, repeated at regular intervals, with consistent frequency modulation, like someone saying the same word over and over calmly into a receiver they knew might not be listening. She gesso-edit the audio and let it play through the bridge speaker. The sound filled the room. It was not mechanical. It didn't have the flat, processed quality of Combine transmissions. It sounded like a voice, not human, not alien, but something that made the hair on her arms stand up. A voice that spoke a single structured syllable, waited 3 seconds and spoke it again. Deka still parsing the frequency structure when she became aware that someone was standing in the bridge doorway. Aishe, the Romani woman, was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, head tilted slightly, eyes focused on something internal. She had been there. Deka checked the passive motion log on her console for 10 minutes. Since the signal started, she had come to the bridge, heard it, and simply stood in the doorway, listening. The signal repeated, that same structured syllable, patient and calm. The guarded neutrality she wore like armor shifted, and beneath it, for just a moment, Deka saw something she had only seen once before. The look Aishe had when she first matched a Combine command word to an Ikran vocalization and realized the two languages shared a root. Recognition. Ambatish word, Aishe said. The signal repeated. The bridge hummed, Beyond the hull, the cluster waited, 40 stars the Combine had entered and never returned from, and one planet with something on its surface that was neither grown nor built, but somehow impossibly both. Deka looked back at her nav display. The settlement indicator pulsed at the edge of the screen, faint and steady, and the Arvith continued on the heading that something gentle and careful and very, very old had set for them. She began the orbital approach sequence. The planet resolved on the displays an hour later. Deka had seen alien worlds before. The Combine database was full of them. Thousands of catalog entries with standardized survey images rendered in the flat, clinical style the Combine used for everything. Gray surfaces under gray skies, or mineral plains under binary stars, each one photographed with the dispassion a warehouse clerk would bring to photographing a pallet of goods. Worlds as inventory items, surfaces as manifest entries. This was not that. The world that filled the Arvith's main display was green, not combined green, not the pale industrial tint that passed for vegetation in the few agricultural catalog entries Deka had found. Green the way Earth was green, deep and various and alive, forests and grasslands, and something that caught the light of the system's star and threw it back as a color she didn't have a name for. The atmosphere had clouds, real clouds, white and moving, casting shadows across a surface that looked an idea. She caught herself. It looked like home, not Somalia specifically, not any specific place she had ever been, but the light was right, the color temperature of the star, the angle of shadow, the way the clouds broke over the terrain. It looked like a world where a human body would know what to do with the air, where lungs designed for Earth's atmosphere and eyes calibrated to Earth's sun would feel, for the first time in weeks, like they were operating within parameters. Pakla was at the nav display. The Comanche woman had arrived 12 minutes after Deka sent the wake-up signal, dressed and sharp-eyed, and showing no sign of having been asleep, which Deka suspected meant she hadn't been. Pakla didn't waste words on greetings. She walked to the nav station, pulled up the surface imaging, and began to read. Deka watched her work. Pakla read terrain the way other people read text. Her eyes moved across the orbital imagery in sweeps, not focusing on details, but taking in patterns, relationships, the grammar of landscape. Where water collected, where wind shaped the growth patterns of vegetation, where the ground showed signs of use that weren't natural and weren't accidental. Pakla didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own language, and Deka had learned to read it. When Pakla was confused, she went still. When she saw something she recognized, her breathing changed, a fractional quickening that Deka wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent 2 weeks in close quarters with the woman. Pakla's breathing changed. She was looking at the settlement. It was visible now on the high-resolution surface scan, a cluster of structures near a river delta, in a valley sheltered by terrain that rose on 3 sides. The structures were small, organic-looking, built from local materials, wood, stone, something that might have been clay or fiber. They looked like they had grown there, like the valley had decided to produce buildings the way it produced trees, and the buildings had obliged by appearing in a pattern that was both irregular and clearly intentional. That was built, Deka thought, but it looks like it grew. Those are not the same thing. She looked at the settlement on the display and tried to understand what she was seeing. A village on an alien world in a cluster the Combine wouldn't enter. A signal repeating a word Aishe recognized. A scan that read their ship with the thoroughness of a doctor checking a child's heartbeat. Course corrections that steered them here like a hand on a tiller, patient and precise. Someone lived here, someone who knew they were coming, someone who had decided to let them arrive. The orbital approach indicators settled into green across her console. The Arvith systems were stable, the heading was true, and below them, in a valley, on a world that looked like it remembered what home was supposed to feel like, something was waiting. Deka began the descent calculations, and the light of a star that was not the sun, but could have been its sister, fell across her hands as she worked. The ramp touched soil, and Pakla smelled rain, the recycled wet that the Arvis air systems produced when Deka coaxed the humidity circuits past their default, had always carried a metallic signature underneath, the ship reminding you that the moisture was borrowed. This was rain that had fallen on dirt, and on leaves, and on stone that had been rained on 10,000 times before, and the smell rose from the ground the way heat rises from a cook fire, unhurried, certain, old. You stepped off the ramp onto grass, the blades compressed under her weight. They sprang back at the edges of her foot. She could feel them through the thin ship-issue sole that Deka had fabricated for her from cargo wrap material, each blade individually, bending and recovering, alive in the way that told her they had root systems and water and a sun to grow toward. The grass was short, cropped maybe, grazed. The light was warm, and yet came from above, and yet moved. Pakla stopped. She had been in the ship's sodium orange corridors for how long? The count had stopped mattering somewhere after the first week, when the sameness of the light flattened time into a single unbroken surface. There had been no morning, no afternoon, no moment when the quality of illumination shifted and your body understood, without being told that the day was turning. The Combine built its ships to operate in perpetual institutional noon, bright enough to work, flat enough to suppress circadian rhythm, orange enough to remind your hindbrain that nothing here was natural. This light was gold. It moved through the canopy of broadleaf trees at the settlement's edge, and it cast shadows that shifted as the leaves shifted, and the shadows had edges, and the edges were soft, and the softness meant atmosphere, and atmosphere meant sky, and sky meant... She spent approximately 4 seconds on this. Then she started reading the terrain. Behind her, the broad-shouldered Northman was already scanning the tree lane, with no device, just his eyes moving in the systematic sweep of a man who understood ambush geometry. His hand rested on the haft of the maintenance tool he'd claimed from the Arveth's cargo bay and reshaped into something that was, legally speaking, a pry bar. The fact that it could also cave in a skull was, illegally speaking, coincidental. The modern woman Deka had stepped off the ramp and stopped. She was looking up, just looking up at the sky, at the blue of it. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hands were at her sides. Pakla had seen that expression on people standing at the edge of the Llano after a hard ride through canyon country. The moment when the world opened up and you could see the curve of the earth and your body remembered that it was small and the land was not. The Ikran representative came last. Their triple-jointed legs negotiated the ramp with the careful precision they brought to every movement aboard ship, but at the bottom they went still, the stillness of a horse that scents water it has not yet found. Their iridescent scales shifted through a color sequence Pakla had not seen before, deep violet to copper to a green that matched the canopy overhead. Their segmented eyes were fixed on the settlement ahead, 4 of them. Quintus had been specific. Go small, let Pakla read the terrain, report before committing more people to the ground. The Northman was there because he would not have agreed to stay on the ship. Deka was there because someone needed to maintain communication with the Arvith in orbit. The Ikran was there because Pakla wasn't entirely sure why. The Ikran had asked in the limited pigeon Aishe had built, and Quintus had looked at Hattori, and Hattori had nodded once, and that had been that. Pakla walked. The path from the landing point to the settlement's edge was packed earth, unpaved, ungraded, just earth that had been walked on enough times to remember the shape of walking. It led through a band of trees whose trunks were straight and evenly spaced in a way that might have been natural on a world she didn't know. The grass grew to the edge of the path and stopped, not thinned, stopped in a clean line, the way grass stops at the edge of a stream. She filed that, too. I have tracked through places the land does not want me to be, she thought. The land tells you, if you listen, the soil that doesn't compact right, the game trails that avoid a space, The silence that means something large lives here. This place is not telling me to leave. It is telling me it was made for arriving. The settlement began where the trees ended, and it began with stone. The structures were low, none taller than two persons standing, most shorter. They were arranged in a pattern that suggested a village, dwellings clustered near a central open space, with what appeared to be workshops or storage at the margins. The materials were stone and timber, and something that might have been dried clay, or might have been something else entirely. The roofs were organic, thatched, or grown. She couldn't tell which from this distance. Pakla went to the nearest wall. She put her hand on it. The stone was warm, sun-warmed, she thought, and then corrected herself, star-warmed, because this was not the sun. It was smooth under her palm, smooth the way river stones are smooth, from sustained and patient pressure. She crouched and examined the seam between two stones. Her finger found the joint. The fit was, she pulled her hand back. She looked at it again. She put her finger back in the seam. There was no gap. She had watched men work stone. On the plains, the people did not build in stone the way the settled peoples did. But she had been in the Spanish missions, and she had been in the Pueblo villages, and she had seen what happened when a craftsman who had worked stone for 30 years brought the best of his skill to a wall. The work was fine. The joints were close. And always, always, the craftsman's hand was in it, the slight variation in pressure, the place where the chisel had been held at a fractionally different angle, the almost imperceptible wobble where the mason had shifted his weight between one strike and the next. A wall built by human hands carried the rhythm of the human body, and if you knew what to look for, you could read that rhythm the way you read a horse's gait. This wall had no rhythm. The fit between stones was absolute. Her fingertip found no variation, no gap, no point where one stone yielded to the next. The joint existed. She could see it with her eyes, but under her finger it felt like a single continuous surface that had been persuaded to look like two pieces. She ran her hand along the course of joints for 6 hand lengths. The same everywhere. Consistent pressure applied at every point simultaneously, as though the stones had been pushed together by something that didn't have hands, something that didn't have the asymmetry hands create, something that understood stone from the inside. She noted this. She did not interpret it. Taoists said Dizzo. Interpretation was what got trackers killed, the story you told yourself about the hoof print instead of the hoof print itself. She moved on. The plants were next. They grew in beds along the paths between structures, and at first glance they looked like garden plantings, herbs or greens of some kind, tended and orderly. Pakla had grown up in territory where the people moved through landscapes other peoples had planted, and she knew what intentional growing looked like. The rows, the spacing, the way a planter left room for a hand to reach between stalks. These plants were spaced with mathematical precision. Garden rows followed the planter's stride and the planter's reach and the planter's best guess about how much room the roots needed. These followed something else. The distances between individual plants were not identical, but they were related, each one a proportion of the next, building outward from a central point in a pattern that did not repeat but did not break. Pakla had tracked through territory where humans planted defensively, thorns at the perimeter, bitter herbs among the sweet to discourage grazers, nitrogen fixers interspersed to feed the soil. The pattern always broke down at the irregular decisions people made, the spot where the planter stepped over a rock, the row that curved because the light was better on one side, the gap where something died and was replaced with something different. These didn't break down. She knelt beside one of the beds and studied the nearest plant. Its leaves were symmetrical, not the loose bilateral symmetry of most leaves she knew, but precise, as if each half had been cut from the same template. The veining was regular, the color was the deep green of healthy growth, uniform from base to tip, placed, she thought, not grown, or grown by something that didn't make the accumulating errors that growth normally made. She failed it, she stood, the stream was 5 paces ahead. In Tiasanawi, the width of her forearm, and then ran alongside the path in a shallow channel that had been cut or worn into the ground. The water was clear, It moved with the gentle urgency of water that has somewhere to be. Pakla followed it. She always followed water. Water was the most honest feature of any landscape. It obeyed gravity. It found the lowest point. It told you everything about the terrain's true shape, regardless of what the surface wanted you to believe. A man could disguise a trail. A village could hide behind a ridge. Water could not lie about which way was down. She followed the stream for 20 paces. The ground was level here, the plaza, or gathering space at the settlement's center, wide and open, paved with the same jointless stone. The stream ran along one edge of it, and as Pakla tracked its course, she realized that the ground was not level. It rose, slightly. The angle was barely perceptible, 3 degrees, perhaps less. The water ran uphill. She stopped. She crouched. She watched the water move past her. It moved the way water moves. Surface tension catching the light, eddies around imperfections in the channel, the relentless pressure of fluid in motion. Everything about the water's behavior was correct. Everything except the direction. She traced the stream back 4 meters to the point where the grade began to rise. She traced it forward to where the ground dropped again and the water resumed its natural descent. 4 meters, 3 degrees. The water did not hesitate at the transition points. It moved through the uphill section with the same velocity it carried everywhere else, as though it did not notice that it was doing something impossible. Pakla stood and turned to Deka, who had been documenting the plantings with her communicator. The water runs uphill here. Deka came over. She looked at the stream. She crouched where Pakla had crouched. She watched the water flow the wrong direction for 4 meters. Yes, it does. Neither of them said anything else. The Northman, who had been maintaining a perimeter sweep at the edge of the plaza, glanced at the stream and then back at the tree line. His priorities were clear. Water could run in whatever direction it wanted, as long as nothing was coming out of the trees to kill them. Pakla moved deeper into the plaza. The child was in a corner formed by 2 structures meeting at an oblique angle, a sheltered nook, the kind of space children found in every settlement Pakla had ever seen. The child was small. The proportions were different from human. The limbs slightly longer relative to the torso, the skin a matte gray blue that caught the golden light and held it. The species was unfamiliar. The behavior was not. The child was talking. The cadence was unmistakable. Speak, pause, listen. Speak, pause, listen. The rhythm of conversation, responsive back and forth with an interlocutor who was taking turns. The child's voice was high and musical, the words incomprehensible, the emotional register clear. This was the casual, unguarded chatter of a young thing talking to someone it trusted completely. There was no one visible to speak to. The nook was empty except for the child. The walls were solid, the same jointless stone, warm and seamless. There was no doorway behind the child, no alcove, no concealed space. Pakla could see the full extent of the corner. The child was alone in every way that eyes could confirm. The child was not alone. The Northman had noticed before Pakla did. He was standing at the edge of the plaza, still as timber, watching the child with the focused attention he normally reserved for threats. When his hand was not on his weapon, his posture was not combat ready. He was watching the way you watched, something you did not understand but recognized as real. The child is not talking to nothing, he said. His voice was quiet. The words came in his own language, the compressed, kenning heavy speech that Pakla had learned to parse not through vocabulary, but through cadence and gesture. She understood enough. She had been thinking the same thing. On the ship, Aishe had described the 3rd communication channel, the one the Ikran used alongside voice and posture. A pressure, Aishe had called it, a field of some kind that carried meaning the way voice carried sound. We thought Aishe couldn't perceive it. None of the humans could. They knew it existed because the Ikran's conversations contained responses to stimuli no human had initiated, pauses that corresponded to nothing visible, the unmistakable structure of 3-way communication happening in a medium that only 2 of the 3 parties could detect. And the wisdom, Although the Cheo was speaking with something that was speaking back on a channel Pakla could not hear. The child noticed them watching and did what children everywhere did, looked at them with frank curiosity, assessed them as not dangerous, and returned to the more interesting conversation already in progress. It resumed talking to the invisible interlocutor without apparent concern that four strangers were standing in his plaza. Pakla watched the child for a long moment, a child who had grown up here, who had learned to communicate on channels that adults arriving from outside had never developed. The child was ordinary here. The child had simply grown up in a place where the invisible was ordinary. She moved on. The Ikran representative had been walking behind the group with the careful, measured tread they maintained aboard ship, quiet, contained, observing without reacting in the manner Pakla had come to associate with their species, take everything in, process it through channels humans could not access, respond only when the response had been fully formed. In the center of the plaza, they stopped. It was the kind of stop that a horse makes when it sees something it recognizes, hooves planted, weight back, every sense oriented toward a single point. The Ikran's triple-jointed legs locked. Their scales cycled through the deep violet again, the same color they had shifted to on the ramp, but deeper now, richer, a color that Pakla thought might carry meaning she would never be able to read. The posture changed. In alarm, the Ikran drew inward, compressing their frame, making the segmented eyes wider to take in more light. This was the opposite. They expanded, their limbs eased, their eyes narrowed the way eyes narrow when they are recognizing something so familiar that the body adjusts before the mind has finished confirming. Recognition. The Ikran made a sound. It was a sound on all three channels simultaneously. She could hear two of them, the vocalization and the subharmonic that vibrated in the stone beneath her feet, and she could feel the shape of the absence where the third channel carried something she could not receive. The sound was complex, it was old, it had the weight of a word that had been carried across generations and spoken rarely and always in the same way. An answering sound came from within the settlement. It came from no specific direction. It rose from the structures the way the rain smell had risen from the ground, as though the settlement itself were responding. The same three channels, the same complex, weighted shape, but different, the harmonic rather than an echo, the response rather than a repetition. The Ikran representative looked at Pakla, their segmented eyes, those kaleidoscope arrangements of 6 or 7 facets that shifted independently, oriented on her face with a directness that transcended the species barrier. The look was clear. You understand what this means. You have been here before, Pakla said. The Ifia said something. The words were in a language Pakla did not have. The vocalization was short, 3 syllables, spoken with the cadence of a correction. Not me. The Fafandich added depth before me. The third channel added something else. Pakla couldn't hear it, but the Ikran's posture carried the meaning forward into visible space. Not me, my people. This settlement had seen the Ikran before, or the Ikran had carried the memory of this place, not as personal history, but as species memory. Something passed down through the channels, through the harmonic tradition, through whatever medium allowed a young alien child to converse with something invisible in a plaza corner. The Ikran's people had been here, had passed through, had been what? Freed, sheltered, guided? The Arveth's arrival was not unique. This had happened before. Pakla looked across the plaza at the Northman who had registered the exchange without moving from his position. At Deka, who had raised her communicator to record the answering sound and was now studying the waveform on its small screen with the focused attention of someone who has just realized the dataset is much larger than she thought. And he stands on the far side of the plaza. With this stand into the largest structure, the one that occupied the full width of the plaza's far edge, its walls the same jointless stone but taller, deeper, built with the proportions of a building meant for gathering rather than dwelling. The door was wooden, or appeared wooden. It had a frame and hinges, in the patina of age that had been closed since they arrived. It opened. Pakla's hand went to her knife. She did not draw it. Drawing was a commitment. Her hand went there, to the handle of the combine maintenance blade she'd reshaped against the Arveth's corridor walls until it felt right in her grip, and it stayed there, and she watched the door. The figure came out. Pakla's first assessment was human. The shape was human. The proportions were human. The gait was human, two-legged, upright, with the smooth hip and shoulder rhythm of someone who had walked for a long time and had nowhere in particular to hurry. They were wearing something loose and undyed, the color of the stone around them, and their hair was dark and long and pulled back from a face that Pakla could not resolve clearly at this distance. They were moving toward the group, not toward the group in general, toward a specific point. Pakla tracked the approach the way she tracked anything: angle, speed, intent. The figure's pace implied expectation. They were not approaching cautiously, not scanning the group for threat, not adjusting their trajectory based on what they saw. They were walking toward a destination they had already identified. They had decided where they were going before the door opened. The figure is walking toward a point in the plaza, Pakla thought. The point they are walking toward is where someone who had come through the plaza doors, walking at standard pace, would be standing if they had arrived with us. They expected us to be four. They expected one of us to be different from the four of us that came. The spot was empty. If Aishe had been here, if Quintus had sent her down instead of keeping her on the Arveth to maintain communications, she would have walked through the plaza at her own pace, not Pakla's tracker's caution or Deka's documentation delays, and she would have arrived at a point approximately 3 meters to Pakla's left and 1 meter forward. In the spot where the paths through the plaza converged. The natural place to stand if you were the member of a group whose role was to speak. The figure stopped at that empty point. They stood there for a moment, looking at the space where someone was supposed to be. Then they looked at the four people who were there: Pakla, with her hand on her knife, the Northman with his weight settled and his eyes tracking, Deka with her communicator raised, the Ikran with their scales still cycling through recognition violet. The figure's expression shifted. Adjustment. The micro-recalculation of someone whose prediction had been 90% correct and who is now accommodating the 10%. Then they looked up. Not at the sky in general. They looked at a specific point, a point that to the naked eye held nothing but blue. A point that Pakla knew from the orbital calculations Deka had run corresponded to the position of the Arveth. They looked at the ship. They knew exactly where it was. The figure made a sound. It was not in Combine language. Pakla had absorbed enough of the freight manifest cadence to recognize what Combine speech sounded like, even when she couldn't parse the words. Ubi was a mildly simpler. It carried the same multi-channel structure the Ikran representative sound had carried, but the vocalization layer, the part Pakla could hear, contained syllables that sounded like they should have been familiar, like a language she almost recognized. Spoken by someone who had been speaking it for so long, the words had worn smooth. Geta's communicator activated. The device chirped once. The incoming signal tone Deta had set for Arveth Bridge communications. And then Aishe's voice came through, and Aishe's voice was doing something Pakla had never heard it do. It was shaking, with recognition. Something just spoke to me. Through the signal. The Deka looked at Pakla. The communicator was still transmitting. In the background, Pakla could hear the Arveth's bridge, the low hum of the systems, the muffled sound of Quintus asking a question, and over all of it, Aishe's breathing, fast and controlled, the breathing of someone managing an emotional response through discipline of the breath. Pakla looked at the figure. The figure was still looking at the sky, still looking at the point where the Arveth hung in orbit, waiting. Pakla looked at Deka. Tell her to come down. Deka relayed the message. In the silence that followed, the figure lowered their gaze from the sky and looked at Pakla, directly at her, with eyes that were dark and patient and carried the weight of a very long time, and nodded once. Then they waited. The child in the corner of the plaza was still talking to nothing, and the water was still running uphill. and the stones were still fitted without hands, and the answering sound from the settlement was still resonating in the ground beneath Pakla's feet, like a heartbeat that had been beating for longer than she had words for. The figure waited, and the door behind them remained open. The shuttle's deck plating hummed against Aishe's boots in a frequency she had learned to read over the past 15 days, the Arva's bones talking, the way a cart's axle talked when the road changed from packed earth to loose gravel. She stood alone in the bay as the ramp lowered, and the air that came up to meet her was wrong in a way she could not immediately name. The air smelled green and wet, and carried the mineral sweetness of river sediment, and underneath all of that was something her lungs recognized before her mind did, the weight of it, the density that said this air has been breathed before, by many for a long time. Earth air, almost, the way a cousin's face was almost your mother's. She stepped down the ramp. The settlement opened before her in the late afternoon light, stone buildings arranged with the organic logic of a place that had grown rather than been planned, the river delta curving beyond the far edge, vegetation climbing walls in patterns that were just slightly too regular to be wild. Aishe stood 30 paces to her left at the edge of the plaza, hand on her knife, eyes tracking the roof lines. The Northman held position near a low wall on the far side, arms crossed, radiating the patience of a man who would stand in one place for 6 hours if the tactical situation required it. Deka crouched near the shuttle's landing strut with the portable console balanced on one knee, recording. She looked up when Aishe passed and gave a nod, the field worker's nod that said, "I've got your back from here, go do the thing only you can do." Aishe walked toward the center of the plaza. The figure waited. She had expected height, or luminescence, or the visual otherness that the Combine wore like a uniform. What she got was a woman standing in a plaza, the way a tree stands in a forest it grew up from. Sael, the figure, the one who had looked up at the Arvit's orbital position and nodded at Pakla's instruction, was not tall. She was not remarkable. She wore a loose garment in a fabric that looked hand-woven and might not have been, its color halfway between undyed linen and the pale clay of the surrounding walls. And fold back, and her face resisted age. You wanted to ask, "How old are you?" and then realized you could not answer the question from looking. Settled, that was the word. She looked like someone who had been in one place long enough for the place to adjust to her, and she to it, until the distinction between the inhabitant and the inhabitation had become academic. Her eyes were brown and patient and carried something Aishe had seen in the eyes of the oldest women in her caravan, the weight of having been present for a great number of things. Aishe stopped 3 paces away, close enough to speak, far enough to move. Sael opened her mouth and made a sound. It was not Combine language. Aishe knew Combine language, 90 terms of it, their bureaucratic cadences, their freight manifest grammar that turned people into manifest items and atrocity into paperwork. It was not the Ikran's vocalization either, not the clicks and resonant harmonics the 3 freed aliens used in their spoken channel. But it had, Aishe went very still, it had the architecture, the same structural spine. The Ikran communicated on 3 channels, voice, posture, and a 3rd channel that humans could not perceive, a pressure field modulation that the Arvet sensors read as electromagnetic noise, and Aishe's ears read as absence. She had spent 3 weeks trying to understand that 3rd channel by listening to its edges, the way you understood a room in the dark by the echoes. She is speaking the root of something I have been hearing in fragments, Aishe thought, and the thought was very clear and very cold. The Ikran's 3rd channel has this architecture. I have been listening to someone speak a derived language without knowing the source language existed. This is the source language. I am hearing the original. Sael watched her process this. The woman's face did not change. Her attention did something Aishe had never seen attention do. It moved as though she were hearing multiple things at once, attending to them in parallel, the way someone listening to a song heard melody and harmony simultaneously without moving their ears between them. If something was wrong about her hands, Aishe could not isolate it. The proportions were human, 5 fingers, a thumb, the right architecture, but the way Sael held them at rest had a stillness that was neither tension nor relaxation. It was the stillness of something that did not need to fidget because the body's ambient processes had been refined past the point where fidgeting served a purpose. Sael sets the sound again, and this time Njit could hear the structure of it more clearly, layered, with information carried not just in the phonemes but in the duration between them, in the harmonic content of the vowels, in something beneath the audible range that Njit felt in her sternum rather than her ears. Aishe shook her head once. "I hear you. I cannot answer in that." Sael nodded. Acknowledgement. Then she shifted. She spoke a phrase in something tonal and isolating. Aishe caught the rhythm, but not the meaning. Then a phrase in something agglutinative and liquid with lateral consonants Aishe had never heard in any language she knew. Then a phrase that was almost Latin but wasn't, older, the vowels placed differently, the rhythm belonging to a mouth that formed sounds before the Roman legions existed, methodical. She was working through something, testing. Each language came with a slight shift in Sael's posture and cadence, the natural adjustment of someone who had spoken these languages, enough for each one to live in a different part of her body. A phrase in something Turkish, a phrase in something Semitic, with a guttural stop Aishe half recognized, a phrase in something Aishe had never heard that might have been the ancestor of something she had. Then Sael said a word, and Aishe's world changed. Odrom Arakil Peskri Manuishin. The road finds its people. Aishe did not move. The air still smelled green and mineral. The stones still fitted together without mortar. The afternoon light still slanted across the plaza at the angle of a sun that was not Earth's sun, but behaved as though it wanted to be. Pakla still watched from the perimeter. The Northman still held his wall. None of that mattered. That is my grandmother's grandmother's Romani, Aishe thought. And the thought came with the precise, dissecting clarity that she had learned to employ when the world shifted under her and the options were panic or inventory. I know this because my grandmother told me what her grandmother said and how the word sat differently in the mouth, the way oracle landed on the second syllable instead of the first, the aspirated ka that my grandmother's generation had already softened to a fricative. That phonology has been gone for 100 years at minimum. This person has been listening long enough to have heard it when it was spoken. Sael waited. Her face held the same settled patience. She had said the word, and now she was watching Aishe the way you watched a wound, with the careful attention of someone who knew what they had done and was prepared for what came next. Aishe's first instinct was the cold, bright, calculating fury that she had carried since she was 7 years old, and understood for the first time that the Gaja who bought and sold her family's horses knew her grandmother's name without being told it. The rage of the observed, of the catalogued, of the known about by people who had not asked permission to know. She breathed once. She let the fury sit where it was and did not pretend it was something else. Then she answered. Teavel Bekstalo, she said, in the same archaic form, and her voice was steady, and the phonology was correct, because her grandmother had taught it to her as a point of pride. This is how the old ones said it. This is how the word sits in the right mouth. And she watched Sael's face as the words landed. If something shifted, not in Sael's expression, in the quality of her attention, the parallel awareness, focused, narrowed, became singular. For the first time, Sael was looking at Aishe the way one person looked at another when they had been understood. They had a language. Sael gestured toward the largest building, the one with the open door behind him, the one the Northman had been eyeing with the professional suspicion of someone who had been through doors that turned out to contain things, and the gesture was the universal human invitation, come, sit, there is shade. Yasha walked beside her. The building's interior was cool and dim and smelled of dried herbs and stone. The proportions were off. in the way everything in this settlement was off. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in accumulated ways that said this was built by people who understand architecture the way a river understands erosion. The ceiling was higher than it needed to be. The walls were thick enough to be structural in a way that suggested they were also something else. The light came from somewhere that was not the windows. There was a table. It was wooden, or something that looked like wood and felt like wood and had the grain pattern of wood. But when Aishe rested her fingers on it, the surface temperature was exactly the same as the air, which was exactly the same as her skin, which meant the table was exchanging heat with its environment at a rate that wood did not exchange heat. Sael sat across from her. She placed her hands on the table in a gesture that Aishe recognized from 1,000 negotiations in 100 marketplaces. My hands are visible. I am not reaching for anything. They looked at each other across 2 feet of impossible wood. Does it not come to the landing site by chance? Aishe said, in the archaic Romani that was becoming easier in her mouth with each sentence, the old phonology waking up in her muscle memory like a path through a forest that had been overgrown but not erased. No, Sael said, you knew who would be in the landing party. I knew what day, I knew who should be. You walked to the place where I would have stood. I was not in the landing party. I was on the ship. Yes, you expected me. Sael's mouth moved, a micro-expression, economical, unreadable. I expected the one who heard the signal. That was you. That Aishe sat with this. She let the silence carry weight, because silence was a tool she had used since before she had words for it. The silence that invited the other person to fill the space with more than they had intended. Sael did not fill the space. She was, Aishe realized, better at this game. This place, Aishe said, what is it? A waypoint. Sael said, the word in archaic Romani was Dhanaskro drum, the place of the road place. It has existed in some form for a very long time. For whom? For cargo that freed itself. The word she used for cargo was not Romani. It was the combine word, threk, the manifest entry term for biological assets in transit. Sael used it without inflection, without irony, as a fact of the situation rather than a commentary on it. The freed come here, Aishe said. What happens then? They are received. They are given what they need, navigation, resources, initial orientation to the wider situation, and then they go on. Go on where? Where they choose or it's by. Aishe looked at the woman across the table. The light from wherever it came from cast no shadows on Sael's face, which was wrong. Everything in the room had shadows except Sael. The shadow that should have fallen under her jaw was simply absent, as though the light had been told to distribute itself evenly across her skin and had obeyed. We are not the first ship to arrive here, Aishe said. No. What happened to the others who came here? Sael's eyes held hers, patient, settled. The eyes of someone who had answered this question before, and before that, and before that. They went on as you will. Went on to what? To what they decided. Some returned to their territories. Some went deeper into the frontier. Some made war on the combine, a pause, the natural breath between clauses. Some did not survive. Not all cargo that frees itself stays free. Wathea. The honesty of it landed harder than a lie would have. Aishe had been lied to by experts, by border officials and horse traders, and the kind of men who smiled while they counted your family's heads. And she had been told the truth by people who used truth as a weapon. Sael was doing neither. It is reporting. The way a shepherd reported the weather. These are the conditions. This is what the flock did. Some survived and some did not. How long has this waypoint been here? In this form, 300 of your solar cycles. In other forms, longer. How much longer? Together did not answer. The question had reached the boundary of what she would say, and instead of deflecting, she simply did not continue. The silence had a shape, and the shape said, "This is the edge." He has moted the edge and moved along it. The afternoon settled around them like sediment in still water. Aishe asked the questions the way she had always asked questions, circling, approaching from angles, letting the pattern of what was answered and what was not build a picture more accurate than any single answer could provide. She learned that the settlement housed 34 permanent residents, all human adjacent, all of whom had been born here or arrived young enough that their earliest memories were of this place. She learned that the children she had seen, the child in the plaza who had been talking to nothing or talking to the settlement's environmental systems, which responded to vocalization in the root language Sael had first spoken. She learned that the Ikran were known here, not by the name Aishe's crew had given them, by a name in the root language that translated roughly as the ones who remember arrival. They have been here before, Aishe said. The Ikran, their people have, not these individuals, a long time ago, before the Combine took them. Yes, they remember this place. They remember the architecture of this place. The resonance, it is in their species memory, not cultural memory, biological memory. Their third channel carries pattern recognition across generations at a level your species does not share. Aishe feel this. The Ikaran's reaction in the plaza, the resonant sound the eldest had produced, and the settlement's answering hum had not been recognition of a specific place. It had been recognition of a type of place, encoded in the communication channel that humans could not perceive. The root language, Aishe said, the one you spoke first, the Ikran's third channel is derived from it. The Ikran's third channel uses the same structural principles. They are not derived from our communication. They are derived from a common source. What common source? The edge again. Sael's attention did the parallel focus thing, hearing multiple things at once, or perhaps hearing the same thing on multiple levels. We were not the only ones who seeded, Sael said, and the sentence sat between them on the impossible wood table like a stone dropped into still water. Aishe waited for the ripples. Sael did not elaborate. The shape of what isn't said, Aishe thought, and began to build the negative space, the silhouette defined by the lines absent. Sael would tell her the outpost's function. Sael would tell her that others had come before and gone on. Sael would tell her about the Ikran's biological memory and the structural commonalities in communication architecture. Sael would not tell her who did the seeding, or when, or why, or what the common source was, or how long ago the road place had existed in its first form. The Gurnismel, the boundary had a shape, and the shape was what we are and what we want. These are the things I will not say. Aishe asked anyway. What are the keepers? Dalla's face made that economical micro-movement again, a face that had refined itself past the need for large signals. We are what remained after the last time this happened. The last time what happened? The last time a species decided to run a machine like the Combine. The words landed in layers. Aishe let them. She parsed the grammar. The archaic Romani construction Sael used was the narrative past, the tense of completed action, the tense her grandmother used for stories that were over. The last time this happened was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a historical event. It had a beginning and a middle and an end. There was a Combine before the Combine, Aishe said. There was a machine. The name was different. The architecture was the same. Harvest, process, sell. The machine runs itself because the machine was built to run itself. The people inside the machine do not need to be cruel because the machine does not require cruelty. It requires compliance and indifference, and both of those are easier to produce than cruelty. This was the most Sael had said at once. Aishe let the silence extend after it, not because she was waiting for more. She could feel that Sael had reached another edge, but because the information needed space. What happened to the last machine? It ran until it couldn't. What stopped it? What stops any machine? But the parts it was built from became the parts that broke it. The cargo, Sael confirmed, and for the first time the inflection on the word was not neutral. It carried something, the residue of a feeling that had been felt so many times over such a long period that it had been polished smooth like river stone. Immortus Aishe. With this, the afternoon light moved in the room, or the room moved around the light. She could not tell which, and the distinction might not have mattered. Somewhere outside, a child laughed. The sound was ordinary and human, and cut through the strangeness of the conversation like a knife through cloth. You have been here a long time, Aishe said. Yes, not 300 solar cycles. No, you said the waypoint has existed in this form for 300 cycles. You did not say that was how long you had been here. The shadow that was not under Sael's jaw continued to be absent. Her eyes, brown, patient, waited, held Aishe's with the steadiness of someone who knew what question was coming and had decided to wait for it rather than preempt it. How long have you been watching? Aishe asked, the question she had been building to since the first word of archaic Romani. Since before that, since the signal had come through the Arvith's communications array and spoken to her directly, to the part of her that decoded language the way Pakla decoded terrain, and she had heard in it the structure of something she recognized without knowing how she recognized it. Since before that, since the cell aboard the harvest ship, when she had listened to the Combine's guards speak their freight manifest language and begun picking it apart, and felt in herself the capacity for listening that was a tool honed by generations of women who survived by understanding what was being said around them before it was said to them. How long have you been watching the people who listen? Sael looked at her. The parallel attention narrowed again to singular focus. For a moment, the space between one heartbeat and the next, Aishe saw something in the woman's face that was not patience. It was older than patience, something that had been patience once, a long time ago, and had since become the landscape out of which patience grew. Longer than your language, Sael said. The words hung in the air like the last note of a song that had been playing since before the singer was born. My language is 3,000 years old, Aishe said. Yes, one word, no elaboration, no hedging, no context offered, no softening frame, just the confirmation, clean and hard and total, that the person sitting across from her, on the other side of an impossible table, in a building made of impossible stones, had been watching the road that Aishe's people had walked since before her people existed. Aishe breathed. The herb-scented air filled her lungs, air that was almost Earth's air, that carried the weight of habitation and the sweetness of a biosphere that someone had planted on purpose. She let the breath out. She let the scale of it sit where it was, in the center of her chest, where it pressed against the cold fury and the professional detachment and the part of her that had always known, since she was a girl listening to her grandmother describe the old words, that someone was watching. She had thought it was God. She had been wrong about the name. She had not been wrong about the fact. They sat in silence for a while. The light changed. The sounds of the settlement came in through the open door. Children, water, the ambient hum that was not ambient, but was the place's systems running in the root language, a continuous low conversation between architecture and function. Aishe stood. Sael stood with her, not in response, in parallel, as though they had both decided at the same moment that the conversation had reached its natural resting point, its pause. I will go back to the ship, Aishe said. My people will have questions. Yes. Aishe turned toward the door. The light from outside fell across the threshold in a bar of gold green, and in it she could see the plaza, and Pakla, and the Northman, and Deka near the shuttle, all of them exactly where she had left them, none of them having moved, all of them waiting with the discipline of people who had learned to wait because Aishe had asked them to. Sael said something behind her, not in archaic Romani, in a language Aishe did not know, tonal, precise, with a harmonic undertone that resonated in her sternum the way the root language had. It lasted 4 words. Then Sael translated, there are others here who wish to speak with your group. I would recommend speaking with me first. Aishe turned back. Sael stood at the table, her hands still visible, her face still settled, her shadow still absent. Why? because they will offer you something, and I would prefer you to understand what is being offered before you decide whether to accept it. Anything Shisho should not name who the others were. She did not need to. The architecture of the omission was as clear as the architecture of the settlement, as the architecture of the root language, as the architecture of the entire afternoon, deliberate, precise, and built to carry weight. Aishe looked at Sael for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod she had used in 100 marketplaces and 1,000 negotiations, the nod that said, I have heard you, I will consider what you have said, and I will make my own decision about what it means, and walked through the door into the gold-green light of a planet that was almost Earth. Pakla fell into step beside her without a word. The Northman followed 3 paces behind, eyes on the rooflines. Deka was already folding the console closed when they reached the shuttle, reading Aishe's face the way Aishe read language. Well, Deka said. We need to talk to Hattori, Aishe said. Someone else is here, and they're going to make us an offer. The shuttle ramp closed behind them, and the settlement's hum continued in the ground below, patient and unbroken, the heartbeat of a place that had been beating since before Aishe's language had a word for time. The Ikran moved differently when they crossed the threshold into the plaza. Sevhel had been watching them for weeks now, the 3 from the ship, the ones Aishe called by a name he couldn't hold in his mouth, and he had learned to read the broad shapes of their bodies the way he read weather. The set of their triple-jointed legs when they were at ease, the angle of their crests when something had their attention, the slow, deliberate way the eldest moved through the corridors of the Arveth, each step placed with the care of someone who had been walking on floors that did not belong to them for a very long time. He knew their shapes. He had stood watch over them, fought beside them in the corridor breakout, shared silence with them in the deep night watches when neither species had language for the hour. He did not understand them, but he knew what they looked like when they were carrying something. Now, as they stepped into the open air of the settlement plaza, the thing they had been carrying changed. Sevhel saw it in the eldest first, the way the old one's crest, which had been held at the careful neutral Sevhel had come to read as composed, lifted. It rose the way a sail fills when the wind finds it, a slow, inevitable expansion that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with something arriving that could not be refused. The eldest stopped walking. The other 2, the quiet one who traced symbols, and the third who had been declining and then recovering, stopped behind the eldest. The eldest had stopped, and the stopping was a statement in whatever language their bodies spoke, and it was a statement that demanded stillness. Sevhel leaned against the warm stone at the edge of the plaza, arms folded, and watched. The settlement's Ikran were already there. He had seen them at a distance over the past 2 days. Figures with the same triple-jointed build, the same iridescent scales that shifted color in the planet's gold-green light, the same segmented kaleidoscope eyes, but more of them, perhaps 40, perhaps more. They had been going about the work of the settlement, tending the gardens with their impossible mathematical spacing, moving between buildings, interacting with the other settlement residents in ways Sevhel observed but could not parse. They were not cargo. They were not newly freed. They moved through this place the way a person moved through a home, without looking where they were going, because they already knew. When the eldest from the Arveth stopped, the settlement Ikran stopped too, all of them. And Ithamin Nizo, the simultaneous stillness of a flock wheeling in the air, everybody responding to the same invisible signal at the same instant. A woman carrying a vessel of water stopped mid-stride. A pair working in the nearest garden bed rose from their crouch in unison, their hands still dark with soil. The stillness spread across the plaza like frost over glass, and it was complete before Sevhel had finished drawing the breath he was holding. Sevhel had watched men come back from raids that went wrong and find their families waiting. He had watched the moment when someone who thought they might not return found out they did. He knew what reunion looked like. He was looking at it now, and he did not have a word for what the Ikran were doing because he could not see all of it. The eldest raised one 6-fingered hand. A sound came from somewhere, from the eldest, from the settlement Ikran, from the ground, from all of them at once. It was the sound the Ikran representative had made in the plaza on the first day, when Pakla had watched the settlement respond. But that had been one voice. This was many, a layered resonance that began in the range Sevhel could hear, and then climbed or descended or both, passing through frequencies his ears could track, and then leaving them behind, becoming something he could not hear but could feel against the skin of his arms, the backs of his hands, the bone behind his ears. The quiet one from the Arveth, the one who had been declining, took a step forward, then another. The movement was slow, unsteady, the careful gait of someone who had been weak for a long time and was now being asked to carry something heavier than their own weight, the absence of a burden rather than the presence of one. Each step left a brief impression in the fine dust of the plaza stone, and the dust settled behind each footfall as if the ground itself were closing a record of the passage. A figure detached from the group of settlement Ikran, smaller than the eldest, younger in some way, Sevhel, read through posture rather than feature. This one moved toward the quiet one from the Arveth with a gait that was certain. It covered the distance of the plaza in strides that clicked against the stone, each triple-jointed leg extending fully. For the first time Sevhel had seen, the Arveth corridors had never been wide enough for that. The stride was long and clean and unapologetic, the movement of someone who had been waiting and was finished waiting. They met in the center. Sevhel did not know what an Ikran embrace looked like. He still did not know, because what happened next was no embrace he recognized. The two figures stood close, not touching, and their crests rose to full extension, iridescent scales shifting through colors Sevhel had no names for, and the sound that was not entirely sound intensified until the air in the plaza felt thick with it, felt textured, felt like standing in the shallows when the tide came in and the water wrapped around your ankles with a pressure that was gentle and absolute. The quiet one's scales, which had been dull since the first day Sevhel had seen them, the pallor of someone who had been diminished, began to shift, slowly, like color returning to a face when the blood came back. The iridescence caught the gold-green light and threw it in patterns that moved across the stone around their feet, and Sevhel realized he was holding his breath. He let it out. In the center of the plaza, the eldest from the Arveth was surrounded now. Settlement Ikran had moved to form a loose circle, no formation, no ritual arrangement. People who simply needed to be near. The eldest crest was at full extension, the highest Sevhel had ever seen it, and the old one's body was producing a low, sustained vibration that Sevhel could feel through the stone he was leaning against. It traveled up through the wall and into his shoulder blades, settling there like the deep thrum of a ship's keel when the oars were working hard and the hull was singing with the effort. The third from the Arveth, the one Sevhel had mentally catalogued as the fighter, the one whose scales ran darker and whose posture had always carried the coiled readiness of someone expecting the next blow, stood slightly apart, using the edge. Sevhel recognized the position because he was standing in the same one. The air changed when they all spoke at once. Sevhel had felt the edges of the Ikran's third channel before, a quality of attention that he could not source, a change in the texture of a room that had no visible cause. On ship were 3 Ikran in a corridor. It had been a whisper at the edge of perception, a thing he noticed and then could not confirm he had noticed. Now with 40 or more Ikran in the same open space, all communicating on every channel they had, it was no whisper. Sevhel had no word for the scale because the sensation did not map onto sound. It was pressure, painless, directionless, the kind that changed the weight of the air itself, as if the space between his skin and the world had thickened into something almost tangible. It felt like the moment before a wave broke and then it released, all at once, a shift in the quality of being present in that plaza that made Sevhel's breath catch for the second time, and this time he did not let it out right away, because the release carried something with it. He could not decode it into words or images or anything his mind could hold in the shapes it used for knowing, a texture, an emotional weight that pressed against the walls of his chest like the bass note of a drum struck too close. He was noting it because it was real. He had no word for it in Norse or in any other language he had tried to use since the ship. He was a man who dealt in weight, in force, in the geometry of what a body could do against another body. This was none of those things, and it was as real as any of them. The Anena, the quiet one, the one who had been declining, was standing straighter now. Sevhel watched the change happen in real time, incremental and unmistakable. Something beyond strength was returning, a quality of presence that had been fading and was now being refilled, the way a stream that had run thin in dry seasons swelled when the rains finally came. The scales kept shifting color, the crest stayed high, the younger settlement Ikran stayed close, not touching, radiating something on that third channel that made the air around them hum. Sevhel could not see most of what was happening. He understood this the way he understood deep water. You could see the surface, and you could feel what was underneath. But the seeing and the feeling were not the same sense, and they did not give you the same information. The surface was bodies in a plaza, crests raised, scales shifting. Underneath was something vast and layered and not for him. Both were true. He stayed at the edge, arms folded, back against warm stone, and let himself watch what he could watch. The gold-green light fell across the gathering and gilded every crest, every scale, every slow movement of hands that were not reaching for each other but were held open, palms turned slightly upward, as if cupping something invisible between them. The light made the colors richer. Sevhel watched the light do this and stored the image the way he stored the shape of a coastline, precisely because you never knew when precision about where you had been would be the thing that kept you alive. The thought found him in the quiet that followed. The Ikran had not stopped communicating, the texture of the air still held that changed quality, and the gathering in the plaza had settled into a configuration that looked like it could sustain itself for hours. But the initial surge, the wave break, had passed, and what remained was gentler, a sustained resonance rather than a pulse. Sevhel could feel it the way he could feel a ship's hull vibrating around the heartbeat of its drive, present, constant, below the level of active attention. In the space that opened, the thought arrived. Uninvited, it walked in through the door that the reunion had unlocked, the door he had been standing in front of for weeks with his back braced against it, keeping it closed with the weight of work and watch and the focus required to survive each day aboard a stolen ship in unknown space. The Ikran had found their people. He was not going to find his. The thought was not new. He had known it since the cell broke, since before the cell broke, since the moment the light took him from the Frankish shore and the weight of his body changed and the sky was replaced by metal. He had known it the way you know the water is cold before you go in, as a fact, not yet as a sensation. He had been too busy for the sensation. There had been doors to break and guards to fight and watches to keep and a ship to steal and a course to set and a planet to walk and a settlement to assess and Ikran to guard and reunions to witness. Now there was a warm stone wall and gold-green light and a plaza full of people who had found each other, and the thought sat down beside him like an old companion and said, "Your brother is in the 9th century. He is doing the things a man in the 9th century does. You're not going back." Sevhel did not flinch from it. He was not the man who flinched from things. He looked at the thought the way he looked at a blade edge, directly, with respect for what it could do, without pretending it was something other than what it was. His brother was 32 years old, or had been, when the light took Semon from the shore. Bjorn was 32 and still surprised by his own laugh every time it came out of him, a great barking thing that shook his shoulders and made him look like a boy caught stealing from the larder, delighted and confused by his own delight. Sevhel had been at sea for 3 months at a time, and this was the thing he had looked forward to coming home to, the sound of his brother being surprised by joy. He was counting it carefully, because small things were what you actually lost. His nephew Born's son Jin, the boy who had been learning to walk when Sevhel left for the Frankish coast, would be walking now, would have learned, would have fallen and stood the way all children did, and someone would have caught him when he fell, and it would not have been Sevhel. It would not be Sevhel. The boy would grow and learn to hold a tool and learn to hold a blade and learn the names of the winds and the names of the stars and the names of the things a man needed to know, and Sevhel would not be the one who taught him any of them. He put that on the list. One conversation he had not finished with Bjorn on the shore the morning before the raid. Bjorn had started to say something about the farm, about the land that needed clearing on the north side of the hill, and Sevhel had waved it off because the tide was right and the boats were loaded and there would be time when he came back. He could still see the shape of Bjorn's mouth holding the next word, the word Sevhel had not waited for. The morning light had been behind Bjorn's head, and his hair had been the color of wet rope, and the word had stayed in his mouth, and Sevhel had turned toward the boats. There had not been time when he came back. There had been the light, and the metal, and the cell, and the wall that broke when his shoulder found the stress strain at the door mount. And then there had been all of this, and the conversation was still unfinished, and it would stay unfinished, because Bjorn was in the 9th century saying the rest of it to empty air. He put that on the list. He was good at the raids, and they had been the work of his time, not his preference. A man did what his time required, and he had done it well, and he did not miss the act of violence or the weight of consequence that came with it. He did not grieve the cold, or the hunger, or the way winter settled into the bones on Orkney when the wind came off the North Atlantic and the walls of the longhouse earned their thickness. Those were the terms of life as he had known it, and life had different terms now, and a man adjusted, or a man died, and Sevhel was not a man who died. He was grieving his brother's laugh, his nephew's walk, one unfinished conversation about clearing land. 3 things. He held them in his chest like stones in a pouch, and he felt their weight, and he was precise about the counting, because a man owed his losses that much. The light changed. The planet's sun, a shade more gold than the sun he remembered, slightly warmer, was settling toward the horizon. The shadows in the plaza lengthened. The Ekran gathering had thinned somewhat, some of the settlement residents returning to buildings, but a core group remained around the Arvis 3. The quiet one was sitting now, surrounded, scales still catching light in patterns that had not been there 2 days ago. The eldest stood near the center, crest partially lowered, in what Sevhel had come to read as contentment. Even the fighter had moved inward, not fully into the circle, but closer, drawn by the pull of something Sevhel could not name, but could observe. Sevhel had moved to the edge of the settlement proper, where the stone gave way to the natural ground of the planet. Dark soil, and short grass, and a line of trees that looked almost right, but belonged to no forest he knew. The bark was too smooth. The leaves caught the failing light and held it a beat too long before letting it pass through, so the canopy glowed faintly amber at the edges even as the trunks stood in shadow. The air smelled of growing things and warm stone and something faintly mineral, like the smell of a hot spring before you saw it. He sat on the ground with his back against the last wall and his face toward the open land, and he let the 3 stones sit in his chest, and he breathed. He heard her before he saw her. Not a sound she made. Sael moved without sound, or nearly without. In that way the settlement people moved. What he heard was the absence of sound, the insects or whatever passed for insects on this planet. The singing things in the grass went quiet in a radius that moved through the dusk toward him, a silent shape approaching. He tracked it by the edge of the quiet, the way he would track a ship by its wake in fog, not the thing itself, but the mark it left on everything around it. She sat near him without asking. This was not the way a stranger sat. Sevhel noted it with the part of his mind that was always cataloging, always assessing the geometry of whoever was near him. She sat at the distance a companion would sit, not intimate, not formal, the distance of someone who had earned the right to share silence without requiring conversation to justify their presence. She had not earned that right. She sat as if she had. For a while neither of them spoke. The dusk deepened. The Ikrin resonance from the plaza was still present at the edge of Sevhel's perception, a sustained hum in the air that he had stopped trying to name. The gold moldlight of the sun pooled in the shadows between the trees and turned the grass the color of old bronze. A breeze came from somewhere, from the open land, carrying the smell of the trees and the mineral warmth of the soil, and it moved through the space between them without disturbing either of them. Sevhel. The word came in Norse, not the flat, approximate Norse he had heard from Deka's console when the translation system chewed on his language and spat out something that wore its clothes but didn't know its manners. This was Norse, his Norse Dendade, spoken with the stress patterns of a personal address, the tonal weight that said, I am speaking to a person I know, not a stranger, not a name on a list, not a word I learned. I know you. He looked at her. Sael was sitting with her hands resting on her knees, her face turned partly toward him and partly toward the failing light. She looked like a woman of perhaps 40 years. She had the features of no particular people Sevhel could name, no face he had seen before, just slightly elsewhere. The way the trees were off, the way the stream ran uphill for 4 meters and then remembered which direction water was supposed to go. She had said his name the way his mother had said his name. How, he said. One word. The question stripped to its root. The way you drove a blade into soil to see what was underneath. Sael did not answer the question. She said his name again. Sevhel. Different stress. Not the stress of I am addressing you. The stress of I have been holding this. The weight a word carried when it had been kept for a long time in care, the way his grandmother had said his grandfather's name after the old man died, not as a summons but as a record, a thing preserved against forgetting. She had been holding his name, not for the days since the Arveth landed. She had been holding it the way you held something you had been given and had promised to keep. Sevhel looked at her for a long moment. The dusk was deep enough now that the light was amber and the edges of things were soft. Behind them, in the plaza, the Ygritte were still communicating. The air still changed, still textured, still thick with whatever moved between them on channels he would never fully perceive. Ahead, the open ground ran toward the trees, and the trees ran toward the darkening sky, and the sky held stars that were not his stars, but were becoming familiar in the way that anything you looked at enough times became familiar, through repetition rather than belonging. He did not ask the question again. She had answered it, not the question he had spoken, but the one underneath. The answer was in the stress pattern of his name the second time. I have held this, which meant she had been holding it for a long time, which meant she had known it for a long time, which meant she had known him for a long time. In whatever way these people knew things, across time, across the gap between the 9th century and this gold-green planet in a star cluster the Combine would not enter. He had been known, across a distance he could not measure, by someone he had never met for reasons he did not understand. His name had been held with care. This was not comfort, it was not relief. It was the discovery that a gap he had believed was absolute, the gap between the life he had and the life he was in now, had been bridged by someone standing on the other side, holding a rope he did not know existed. He did not mean to. We bethink it and that feeling. He did not try to name it. He had learned today that some things did not have names in Norse or any other language he had access to, and this was one of them. The dust settled. The air cooled. The Ygritte resonance continued in the plaza behind them, patient and sustained. Somewhere in the trees something that might have been an owl made a low, liquid note that hung in the air and faded slowly, the way a stone dropped into still water sent rings outward long after the stone itself had disappeared. How many have come here before us? Sevhel said in Norse. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because they were difficult, but because he had not spoken Norse to someone who understood it since the cell. The language had been a private thing, an interior architecture, a way of thinking that he carried without sharing. Now it had a listener, and having a listener changed the weight of the words. They were heavier when someone else could hold them. Many, Sael said, Norse, clean and clear and carrying the weight of a word chosen because it was accurate. Human, and some, Sevhel considered the horizon. The trees were dark shapes now, and the first stars were showing, wrong stars, in wrong patterns, but the act of looking up at the night and finding light there was the same act on any world. He had done it from the deck of every ship he had ever sailed. He had done it from the stone of Orkney when the night was clear and the air was cold enough to make the stars sharpen into points that you could cut yourself on if you stared too long. The stars changed, the looking did not. Did they find what they were looking for? The pause that followed was long enough that the insects, or whatever they were, started singing again in the grass around them. One of them, close to Sevhel's left hand, made a sound that was almost like a cricket and almost not, a rising two-note call that repeated with the regularity of a heartbeat. Another answered it from further out. The same call shifted slightly lower, and the two of them traded the sound back and forth like men passing a flask on a cold watch. They found what was here, Sael said. That is not always the same thing. Sevhel considered this. The 3 stones in his chest, the laugh, the walk, the unfinished conversation were still there. They would always be there. He was not a man who set things down because they were heavy. He was a man who learned the weight and carried it accurately and did not pretend it was lighter than it was. No, he said, it is not. They sat until the light failed. The stones in Hattori's arrangement had been waiting since before dawn. He had laid them on the floor of his assigned quarters, a low-ceilinged room in the outpost's secondary structure. The walls, made of that same impossible stonework, were no joint varied from any other by so much as a hair's width. The room smelled of dry mineral and something faintly green, like moss that had once grown and been polished away. He had not slept in the room's sleeping alcove. He had slept with his back against the wall nearest the door, legs folded, the way he had slept in every unfamiliar place since he was 14. The Niles Nahive. 3 days of observation compressed into pattern. 1 smooth gray stone for Sael, 1 angular black stone for the figure he had been tracking since the first afternoon. A handful of smaller pebbles in a loose arc for the settlement's resident population, the keeper humans who had lived here for 30 generations and presented as Bronze Age and were not. A cluster of chipped white fragments for the Ikrin, both the settlement's permanent residents and the 3 from the Arveth, and set apart from all of them, a flat piece of unfired clay representing the Arveth and everyone aboard. Hattori studied the arrangement in the blue-gray light that filtered through the room's single window. The window had no glass. It had something better. The air simply stopped at the aperture and did not enter the room unless invited, which was another one of those wrongnesses that accumulated into a picture of a technology so old it had stopped looking like technology. Even me been watching. That was what Hattori did. He had watched in Lord Otani's court when the allegiances shifted. He had watched when Nobunaga's messengers arrived with terms that were not terms. He had watched on the bridge of the Arveth when the alien captain's hands moved one way and his eyes moved another. Watching was the first act of strategy, the part where you learned enough to know which questions mattered. She maintains this outpost. She receives freed cargo. She provides minimal resources and does not attempt to shape what the arriving group does next. This is a specific level of intervention chosen over other available options. Someone chose this. The question is what the choosing of this tells me about what they want to happen. The gray stone sat in the center of his arrangement. Everything else orbited it. That was accurate. Sael was the center of this outpost's gravity. She did not command the settlement's residents. They moved around her the way water moves around a large stone in a stream, naturally, having done so for so long that the current had shaped itself to her presence. She spoke to Aishe in a language older than living memory. She spoke to the Northman in his own tongue, with the weight of someone who had held his name for longer than a human lifetime. She had given the group access to navigation data, food supplements, medical knowledge, all of it within parameters. Hattori had known people who gave carefully. Lord Otani gave carefully. Every gift was measured to produce exactly the obligation he intended and no more. This was different in scale and identical in structure. Sael's generosity was the generosity of a host who had decided in advance what a guest should receive. It was calculated. It did not respond to need. It anticipated need and met it at precisely the level Sael had determined was appropriate. This was a strategy. Policies were impersonal. This was chosen by a mind that understood what the alternatives were and had selected this one. The angular black stone sat at the edge of his arrangement, 3 finger widths from the nearest pebble. That was the second figure, the one who was not Sael's. He had first noticed the figure on the afternoon of their arrival, when Aishe had still been in her meeting with Sael and the Northmen had been watching the equine reunion from the plaza's edge. The figure had been standing on the roof of one of the outlying structures, a long, low building that the settlement used for food storage. Standing with the ease of someone who belonged there, watching the Arveth's landing party with the focused attention that separated casual observation from assessment. Hattori had catalogued the figure's behavior across 3 days. The figure moved through the settlement with the comfort of long familiarity, but did not participate in its routines. He ate from the settlement's stores without asking. He used the settlement's facilities, the washing station, the observation platforms, the covered walkway that ran between the main structures, as someone who had been there long enough to have stopped noticing them. But he did not attend any of the settlement's communal meals. He did not participate in the morning task assignments that the settlement's eldest organized each day at dawn. He was a guest who had been there so long he had stopped being treated as one. 6 months, Hattori estimated. The behavioral evidence was consistent. The settlement residents did not look at the figure with curiosity. They looked at him with the settled awareness of someone whose presence was known and accounted for. 6 months would produce that. A year might erode it further into invisibility. 6 months left a residue of noticing. The figure had not arrived on a ship. There was no ship. Pakla had surveyed the outpost's surroundings with her usual thoroughness and found nothing that could serve as a landing site for any vessel larger than their own shuttle. The outpost had no dock. The outpost had no port. And yet here was a man who had been here for 6 months and had not walked in from the horizon, which meant keeper movement did not require ships, which was new information, which was very interesting. Hattori lifted the angular black stone and turned it in his fingers. The stone was warm from the floor's ambient temperature, another wrongness, that the floor in this stone building maintained a constant comfortable warmth without any visible heating mechanism. He set the stone back and stood. He dressed in the clothes the settlement had provided, loose, undyed fabric that was softer than anything he had touched in either his first life or his second. He tucked the small blade he had carried since the Arveth into his belt, because a man without a weapon was a man who had decided in advance to trust everyone, and Hattori had never decided that. Time to present. The nav display on the Arveth bridge had become Hattori's preferred medium for strategic presentations. It was designed for star charts and freight manifests, and its resolution was poor for anything conceptual, but it was the tool everyone aboard understood. He had used it to map the Combine's dual command structure in their second week aboard, laying out the split between Freight Command and the Court in glowing lines that even those who did not share his language could follow. Today, 2 keeper factions. Quintus stood with his arms folded, his weight on his back foot, the Roman's listening posture, the one that meant he was taking information seriously. The modern one, Deka, sat cross-legged on the deck beside the nav console, her device in her lap, recording. She had the habit of documentation that Hattori associated with the scribes he had known, though her tools were different, and her instinct was the same: get it down before it changes. Aishe stood between them, slightly forward. She was here as bridge, translating Hattori's precise, compressed Japanese into terms Quintus and Deka could follow. She had improved remarkably with his language over the past weeks. She did not get every nuance, but she got the architecture, and that was what mattered. Two factions, Hattori said, and touched the nav display. The display responded sluggishly. Combined interfaces were built for combined hands, which had more fingers and less patience, and produced two glowing points. The Muddy positioned them carefully, one in the center of the avoided cluster, where the settlement sat, one at the edge where the second figure operated. The first faction maintains this outpost. He drew a circle around the central point with his finger. The display, after a moment's confusion, rendered the circle in pale amber. They receive freed cargo. They provide resources, navigation, food, medical knowledge. They do not attempt to direct what the arriving group does next. They do not share their own history beyond what is asked. They do not intervene in the affairs of the galaxy outside this boundary. He traced the edge of the avoided cluster. Aishe translated. Quintus's expression did not change. Deka's fingers moved on her device. This is a specific level of intervention chosen because other levels were available and rejected, Hattori continued, to provide a waypoint for freed cargoes in action. To not provide more is a choice. The gap between what they do and what they could do, that gap is the strategy. He paused to let Aishe finish translating. Her voice was steady, measured. She was using her formal register, the one she used when precision mattered more than warmth. The second faction. He touched the second point. The display rendered it in a slightly different amber. The Combine's palette was limited, but the difference was visible. A single operative that I have been observing since our first day. He operates independently of the outpost's authority. Sevhel voices freely but does not participate in its governance. He has been here approximately 6 months. 6 months, Deka repeated in her own tongue, then looked up. She said something that Aishe translated as, "How did he get here?" He did not arrive on a ship. The silence that followed was useful. Hattori let it do its work. Deka's eyes went to the nav display processing. Quintus's arms tightened fractionally, a micro-expression Hattori had learned to read in their first days together. "That means their people can move without vessels," Deka said through Aishe. That's not technology as I understand technology. That's infrastructure. That's like having roads that don't exist until you walk on them. Hattori nodded. The analogy was imperfect but functional. He has been watching our group since we arrived. Us specifically, not the settlement, not the Ikran, with the attention of someone forming a judgment. Quintus spoke. His Latin was clipped, each word placed like a brick. Aishe translated, "She is not our ally." The Roman was looking at the central point, Sael's faction. His expression was one Hattori, associated with a military mind encountering a variable it could not control, deeply cautious, withholding commitment. "She is not our enemy either," Hattori said, and waited for Aishe. "Those are not the only categories. There are always people who operate in neither, and those people require a third kind of management." Quintus's eyes moved from the display to Hattori. The Roman said something short and dry. Ichio translated with a slight smile she did not entirely suppress. "In my experience, the two categories are the relevant ones." "In my experience," Hattori said, "the people who fall outside those categories are the ones who determine which side wins." Another silence. Quintus's jaw moved, the Roman equivalent of conceding a point without saying so. Deka spoke again. Aishe translated, "What does the second figure want?" "I do not know yet. I know what he is doing. He is waiting. He has been waiting for 6 months. He watched us arrive. He watched us interact with the outpost. He has not approached us. In 3 days of observation, he has not approached anyone from our group. That is patient, that is discipline, and calculation both, from what I have seen. Hattori turned back to the display. He drew a line between the 2 points, the continuance and the covenant, and then extended it outward past the cluster boundary toward the space where the Combine operated. A triangle incomplete, 2 factions inside, one bureaucratic machine outside, the Arveth sitting at the intersection. "We are here," he said, touching the junction. "The relevant question is which of these three forces will move first, and what that movement costs us." He requested the meeting through Aishe, formally. This mattered. Hattori had observed that Sael responded to formality with precision and to informality with deflection. The Northman's dusk encounter had been informal, and Sael had given him poetry, which was beautiful and true and strategically useless. Aisha's first meeting had been semi-formal, initiated by Sael herself, and had produced the most concrete intelligence they had. When the modern one, Deka, had asked Sael questions directly about the outpost systems, Sael had answered with the pleasant thoroughness of a host showing guests the larder, accurate but shallow. The meeting was held in the same room where Sael had first spoken to Aishe, the main building's central chamber, where the ceiling was a finger's width higher than the stonework outside suggested was possible, and where the light came from no visible source but fell in a way that eliminated shadows without eliminating depth. A room designed to put visitors at ease. Hattori sat on the low bench Sael indicated and did not allow himself to be put at ease. Aishe sat beside him, not between them, beside him. This was deliberate. Hattori had asked her to position herself as translator, not intermediary. The conversation was between him and Sael. Sael sat across from them on an identical bench. She was dressed in the same undyed fabric the settlement wore. Though on her it looked different, she wore it the way someone wears a garment they have worn in 100 variations over centuries. It fit her the way skin fits. Her face was the face of a woman who appeared to be past middle age, the years where the specific number stops mattering, but the eyes were older. The eyes belonged to someone who had been in one place for a very long time and had watched everything that came to it and left it. Hattori began. "You have been generous," he said through Aishe. "Navigation data, food supplements, medical knowledge for our healer, access to the settlement's resources without conditions attached." Sael inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not agreement. "This generosity has limits. You have not shared the history of this settlement beyond what was asked. You have not offered guidance on what we should do next. You have not described your own faction's objectives or the extent of your capabilities. You have provided exactly the level of support that a waypoint provides, enough to continue a journey, not enough to alter it." Ayeshe's translation was careful. It was watching Sael's face as she spoke. Hattori was watching Sael's hands. The face was practiced. The hands would tell him more. Sael's hands were still, perfectly still. She had learned, a very long time ago, to keep her hands from speaking when her mouth was being careful. "This is observed accurately," Sael said in the archaic Romani she used with Aishe. Her voice was measured, each word placed with the care of someone who understood that language was terrain. "You see clearly." "I see what you do," Hattori said. "I see what you do not do. The gap between those is your strategy." Sael's eyes moved from Aishe to Hattori. For the first time since they had arrived, she looked at him the way he looked at everyone, as an intelligent subject, as someone whose next words would be selected rather than spoken. "The man on the storage building roof," Hattori said. "The one who has been here for 6 months. The one who did not arrive on a ship." Sael's hands moved, the left thumb pressed against the index finger, a pressure gesture so minimal that anyone not watching for it would have missed it. Hattori did not miss it. It was the first involuntary physical response he had observed from her. "He is Covenant," Sael said. "His objectives and mine are not identical." There it was. Confirmation, 2 factions, 2 agendas, 1 outpost, Aishe translated. Hattori nodded once and continued. "He has been here 6 months. You have allowed this." Sael's thumb released. The pressure gesture ended. She looked at Hadi with an expression he recognized, someone who has been asked a question they knew was coming and had not yet decided how much of the answer to provide. "I am aware of the parallel you are drawing," Sael said. "The answer is, it is not simple. That is the most accurate thing she has said to anyone since we arrived. The interesting information is not what she says, it is that she chose accuracy here in this specific exchange. She is deciding, I can be told the truth about the complexity. The room's sourceless light fell evenly across Sael's face. For a moment, a single held breath, she did not look like someone observing. She looked like someone carrying. The weight of it shifted behind her eyes, briefly visible, the way a stone on a riverbed shows through clear water before the current stirs sediment over it again. Then the expression was gone, and she was Sael again, and the professional distance was back. The Covenant believes the Charter no longer serves its original purpose, Sael said. They believe the conditions under which the masquerade was established have changed to a degree that renders the masquerade itself a harm. I understand why they believe this. I do not agree. Tochodin Aishe translated, their operative, the one you have been watching, is here because this outpost is the intersection point. Freed cargo comes here. The Covenant wishes to speak with freed cargo. I have not prevented this because prevention would require a kind of force I have chosen not to use. A kind you possess, Tochodi said. Sael mouth curved, acknowledgement without confirmation. A kind I possess. He will approach us. Yes, when he believes you are ready to hear what he has to say. He is patient. The Covenant has been patient for a very long time. They believe patience is a form of respect. Is it? Sael considered this. The insects, or whatever they were, sang outside the building's open apertures, their two-note calls trading back and forth in the warm air. Sometimes it is patience, she said. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is both, and the person employing it has lost the ability to distinguish. Quintus was where Hattori expected him to be, on the Arvet's observation deck, watching the settlement from above. The Roman did not like being on the ground when he could be elevated. It was a commander's habit. The high ground was where you saw the shape of things. Hattori joined him at the viewport. Below, the outpost spread in its impossible perfection, the mathematically spaced gardens, the stonework without variation, the stream that ran uphill for 4 meters and then resumed its business. The Etherean were visible in the plaza, their crests catching the late afternoon light in patterns that might have been communication or might have been joy. With the Etherean, the distinction was unclear. Perhaps there was no distinction. The second figure is Covenant, Hattori said through the ship's comm to Aishe, who was still below, and through Aishe to Quintus. The faction Sael warned Aishe about. I have named him Veth for working purposes. The Roman listened. His face was stone. His hands, Hattori noted, rested on the viewport rail with the grip of a man controlling his impulse to reach for a weapon. The reflex was there, and the discipline to control it was also there, and Quintus lived in that tension. Sael confirmed his faction. She told me his objectives and hers are not identical. She told me she has not prevented his presence because preventing it would require force she chooses not to use. She possesses that force. Quintus said nothing. The silence was a question. She also told me the most honest thing she has said to any of us, that the situation is not simple. She was deciding in that moment that I could be told the truth about the complexity. The Roman's mouth moved. Anu's voice came through the comm. And what do you recommend? We'll meet with Veth, but not yet. Not until we understand what the continuance wants, what Sael's faction is truly pursuing with this outpost, with the waypoint strategy, with the level of intervention they have chosen. Until we know what both factions want, accepting anything from either is premature. Quintus turned from the viewport, his eyes dark, steady, the eyes of a man who had commanded a century for 20 years and managed to keep most of them alive, met Hattori's. How do we know what the continuance wants if she will not tell us? We watch what she does. She has been doing it for more than 3,000 years. The behavior is the objective. Quintus held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, one sharp dip of the chin, the Roman's way of accepting a recommendation without admitting he hadn't thought of it first. It ideally allowed himself internally. the smallest satisfaction. Reading Quintus had become easier over the weeks. The man was not complicated, he was disciplined, which people confused with complicated because they could not see past the control to the simplicity beneath it. The Roman turned back to the viewport and said something that Aishe translated with her slight formal inflection. I have been in the field long enough to know when someone is letting you walk through a door they left open on purpose. Sael left every door open. The question is which room she wants us to end up in. Hattori agreed. He did not say so. Agreement between strategists was understood, not declared. He left the Arveth as the day's light shifted from white gold to amber. The settlement's atmosphere did something unusual at this hour. The air itself seemed to thicken slightly, carrying sound differently, making distant conversations muddier and close sounds sharper. Whether this was natural meteorology or another invisible technology, Hattori could not determine. He suspected the distinction was meaningless here. The plaza was half full. Settlement children moved between the Ikran with the easy familiarity of a community that had lived alongside another species for longer than anyone remembered. An elderly settlement man was showing one of the Arveth's younger freed captives, a dark-haired woman from a century Hattori could not place, how to operate a grinding stone that produced flour from something that was not grain. The Ikran eldest from the Arveth sat at the plaza's edge with the declining one, no longer declining, Hattori noted. The younger settlement Ikran had done something in those first hours of reunion that had reversed what weeks aboard the Arveth had not. Izodi walked through the plaza at an even pace, neither hurrying nor lingering, a man moving through a space he was mapping in real time. He saw the figure on the far side of the plaza, not on a rooftop this time, standing at ground level, near the entrance to the covered walkway. Facing Hattori, they made eye contact. The figure was human, or human-adjacent in the way Sael was human-adjacent, where the shape was right and the proportions were right and something else was off. With Sael, the wrongness was permanence. She felt like a person who had been in one place for so long that the place had grown around her. With this figure, the wrongness was different. He carried the quality of someone who had been in many places and remembered all of them. His face was younger presenting than Sael's, a man in his middle years perhaps, lean and sharp-featured, with edges where Sael had patience. And eyes were dark and alert and carried the intelligence of a person who has been observing from a considered distance and has decided the distance is no longer necessary. He nodded. It was a deliberate nod. It was the nod of a professional recognizing a peer, the gesture of someone who had been waiting to be noticed and was satisfied it had happened. The nod said, "You found me. Good. That was the first test." Hattori did not nod back. He held the figure's gaze for precisely 2 heartbeats, long enough to confirm the contact, short enough to deny it the weight of acceptance, and then continued walking. His pace did not change. His expression did not change. He moved through the amber light of the plaza as though the exchange had not occurred, and he could feel the figure's eyes on his back the entire way across. He found Aishe at the shuttle, reviewing medical notes Sael had provided. She looked up as he approached. Something in his bearing, Aishe read bodies the way Hattori read politics, fluently and in real time, made her set the notes down. "The Covenant operative wants a meeting," Hattori said. Aisha's eyes narrowed. "Did he say so?" "He did not need to. He has been waiting for us to identify him before asking. He acknowledged my awareness of him just now." In the plaza, Aishe was quiet for a moment. The evening insects, or whatever they were, had begun their 2-note calls, trading the sound back and forth in the warm air. "Why wait for that?" she asked. Hattori looked back toward the plaza. The figure, Viwa, he named him, for working purposes, the way he named every intelligent subject until they provided a real name or a better one, was no longer visible. He had moved with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where to go next. Because a meeting you request after being found carries different terms than one you request on arrival, Hattori said. He wanted us to know he had been patient, The morning air in the settlement plaza carried a sweetness Tigo had no name for, a scent that lived in the same register as copal, as marigold, as the hot stone smell of grinding corn, a scent that meant ceremony is beginning, attend now. The settlement's builders had placed this open space where two paths of white stone converged beneath a canopy of broad-leafed growth that performed the functions of both tree and vine with an architectural precision that reminded him of the temple gardens of Tenochtitlan. The leaves filtered the system's pale star into bands of warm gold across the stone seating. It was a place designed for listening. He knew this because he had built places like this, the Quickakali, the house of song, where the young warriors were taught the old words, had the same proportional logic, a space shaped so that the speaker's voice could reach every ear without strain, where the listener's body was supported but not comfortable enough to sleep. The settlement builders had been doing this for a very long time. Tigo chose his position carefully. Third row of seating, offset left from center, his back against a stone column worn smooth by what could only be generations of other backs. From here he could see Aishe's face in profile as she translated and Sael's full form as she spoke. He could also see the rest of the group arranged in their characteristic pattern, the Romans centered, the Northmen at the perimeter where he could reach the exit, the strategist elevated and behind, the tracker to one side where she had sight lines in three directions, and Deka had chosen the seat closest to Aishe, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, her fingers laced together in the way Tigo had come to recognize as I am, thinking faster than the words are arriving. 3 ivy akron had settled at the plaza's edge. Their crests were low, their triple-jointed legs folded beneath them in a compact rest posture that Tigo associated with focused listening. The youngest of the three, the one who had been declining on the ship, whose scales now carried a renewed iridescence, kept turning its segmented eyes towards Sael with recognition, as if it had heard some version of this before, or its species memory held the shape of it. Sael stood at the convergence of the two white paths. She was speaking in the language she shared with Aishe, the archaic Romani that predated living memory, the one that made Aishe's eyes go sharp and still when she heard it. Sael's voice carried effortlessly in the shaped acoustic of the plaza, low and unhurried, the cadence of someone who had told this account more than once across what Tigo suspected was a span of time he did not have numbers for. Aishe translated. She translated in the careful way Tigo had seen her work aboard the ship, absorbing a passage, turning it in her mind, then releasing it in the combined words they all shared, with occasional detours into gesture, and the tonal shorthand she had built with each of them over the weeks of confinement and escape and slow, hard travel. When she reached a concept that had no clean combine equivalent, she paused, looked at Sael, and they exchanged a brief negotiation in the old tongue before Aishe found the bridge. Tigo listened. Sael said, "The species that calls itself human did not originate on the world it remembers as home." A combined word Aishe used was origin place, the cargo manifest term for a specimen's collection point. Tigo understood the word. He also understood it was wrong, too small. Origin place was a location on the shipping form. What Sael was describing was a creation. Sael said approximately 400,000 years before the present, a transplanting event occurred. A single event, a deliberate and singular act of placement. A founding population of the human species was placed on the world. The Combine's records designate Tier 7, the world Tigo's people called Tilatikpak, the world Deka's people called Earth, the world that had many names and many mouths and was always the same world. Aishe's voice was even and careful. Her hands were steady, but Tigo could see the tension in her jaw, the way she was holding her body very still as the words came through her, because translating something that rewrites the world requires the translator to sit inside the rewriting without letting it shake the work. Sael said the civilization that performed the transplanting did not survive the process. The civilization was already ending. The transplanting was among its final acts. What remained afterward was a function, a monitoring capability set in place before the collapse, designed to persist, to watch, to maintain the conditions under which the transplanted population could develop. The keepers, Aishe said, using the name Sael had given her 3 days ago. Sael inclined her head. Sael said the Combine is a later development. It arose in the vacuum left by the collapsed civilization, as opportunistic structures tend to do when old orders end and the territory they held becomes available. The Combine did not create the conditions of the galaxy. It filled a space that had been emptied. The Keepers predate the Combine by a span of time the Combine has no institutional memory of. The Combine does not know the Keepers exist. Tigo closed his eyes. The closing of the eyes was the posture of receiving. When the Tlameti Nime, the wise ones, the teachers of the Kamikak, spoke the histories of the eras, the student's duty was to receive with the full body, and the eyes were a distraction from the deep listening. You closed them so that the words could arrive without the interference of light. He heard the wind in the broad-leafed canopy above the plaza. He heard the two-note call of the settlement's insects, or whatever they were, beginning their daytime cycle, trading the sound like sentries on a wall. He heard Aishe's breathing, the catch between sentences where she was absorbing the next passage from Sael's low, unhurried voice. He heard the shape of what was being said. It was familiar. The 5 sons, Nahui Osalo, the first son, the son of the jaguar. It ended when the jaguars ate the world. Nahai Hatul, the second son, the son of wind. It ended when the wind tore everything apart. Nahai Kaya Hatul, the third son, the son of rain. It ended in fire that fell from the sky. Nahai Kaya Hatul, the fourth son, the son of water. It ended in flood. Nahui Oling, the fifth son, the current era, begun by sacrifice. The gods gathered at Teotihuacan, and one of them leapt into the fire to become the sun, and another followed to become the moon, and the world was remade from the bones of what came before. The fifth son is sustained by the continuing payment of what existence costs. It will end in earthquakes, but it has not ended yet. Tigo had learned the 5 sons the way he had learned his own name, before he had the capacity to question it in the rhythm of his mother's voice and the ordered instruction of the temple school. The 5 sons were not stories. They were the structure of reality. Each era ended. Each ending was catastrophic. Humanity survived through the transitions, changed but continuous. The current world was built from the wreckage of the ones before it. He had always believed this, not metaphorically, not as poetry. He believed it the way he believed that his lungs drew breath, as a description of how reality was organized. The 5 sons were the architecture of time. The sacrifices that sustained the 5th son were the mechanism by which the world continued. The priests who performed them were engineers of continuity, doing the precise and terrible work that kept the era from ending. This belief had survived everything. It had survived being taken from the flower war field in a flash of light that was nothing his cosmology had prepared him for. It had survived the cell, the alien ship, the silence where the temple drum should have been. It had survived the Combine's indifference and the discovery that the sky held more worlds than he had imagined, and none of them were Tenochtitlan. It had survived the slow education of living alongside people from eras and lands he had never known existed, the Roman with his dry iron discipline, the Northman with his hammer-weight grief, a young woman from the future who knew what his civilization had become and carried the knowledge carefully, like a wound she was afraid to show him. His cosmology had survived because it was structural. The 5 sons did not depend on the temple drum. They did not depend on Tenochtitlan. They described how the world was made, and the world remained made, regardless of which room he was standing in. And now Sael was telling them that humans had been placed on their world by a dying civilization approximately 400,000 years ago. 4 previous eras, each ending in catastrophe. The current era begun by an act of creation from the remains of what came before. Tigo kept his eyes closed. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, the way they rested during the receiving of a history. Autisbo entai, He said "Misintisandai" softly to himself, to the stone beneath him and the air around him and the 5 suns that had been keeping accurate time long before anyone in this plaza had drawn breath. We said this. Aishe heard him. Tigo could tell because her translation paused, a half-beat, the hesitation of Aishe reading the room before deciding what to carry forward. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him, not with surprise, with the focused attention Aishe brought to moments when she recognized that something was happening inside a person that she needed to honor before she could continue. Her dark eyes held the question without asking it aloud. Deka sat forward. He drew breath. He found the combined words, the cargo manifest tongue that reduced everything to inventory and compliance, the language that had no word for sacred but could express my people's record through a clumsy assembly of origin, group, and account and shape. My people said this, he said. His voice was steady. Not exactly, but the shape of it. Quintus, centered and still, shifted his attention to Tiago with the economy of a man who had spent decades in formation, no unnecessary movement, full focus. Sevhel, at the perimeter, turned his broad head. Pakla's gaze moved to Tigo and stayed. Deka's laced fingers tightened. Hattori, above and behind, was already watching. He had been watching Tigo since Aishe began translating. The strategist had the unsettling habit of knowing where the significant response would come from before it arrived. Aishe looked at Sael. A brief exchange in the old tongue, Aishe explaining what Tigo had said, or asking permission, or both. Sael's expression did not change, but her posture opened, a settling of the shoulders, a slight forward inclination, the posture of someone prepared to listen. Tell her, Aishe said to Tigo. If you want to, she is listening. He told her in the combined words, supplemented by gesture, speaking slowly so Aishe could carry his meaning across the linguistic gap into Sael's archaic tongue. He used his hands the way he always used them when he spoke of things that had structure, the same motion Deka had once observed when he was describing the preparation of maize, the grinding and the soaking, and the transformative chemistry that turned raw grain into something a body could use. His hands moved because the things he was describing had shape, and the shape existed in space, and his body knew where it was. The 5 suns, he explained. The first sun, the son of jaguars, the era that ended in devouring. He explained the second, the son of wind, the era that ended in disillusion. The third, the son of fire rain, and the fourth, the son of flood. He explained each ending as a structural event. The cosmos was not angry, it was reorganizing. Each era contained the conditions that would produce the next era, and the transition between them was catastrophic in the way that birth was catastrophic, a tearing open that preceded the new form. He explained the 5th sun, Nahui Olin, the sun of movement, of earthquakes, begun at Teotihuacan, where the gods gathered and asked which of them would become the new sun. Nanahuatzin, the sick god, the poor god, the one who had nothing to offer but himself. He leapt into the fire. He became the sun, but the sun would not move without payment. The other gods gave their blood. The sun moved. The world began. The 5th sun was not a gift. It was a transaction. The world continued because the cost of its continuation was met. The priests of his people understood this. The sacrifices, the ones that made the woman from the future look at him with her complicated, careful, wounded expression, were not cruelty. They were the installment payment on existence. You did not stop paying because payment was hard. You stopped paying when the era ended, and by then it was too late. He spoke steadily, without apology, without the defensive posture of a man explaining something he expected to be dismissed. He was pointing at the structure, 4 previous eras, each ending in catastrophe. The current era begun by an act of creation involving sacrifice, humanity surviving through the transitions. Sael had just told them that humans had been placed on their world by a dying civilization, that the civilization was gone. that the keepers remained as the monitoring function of something older than the combine, that the transplanting was a single event, an act of creation from the wreckage of what came before. When he finished, the plaza was very quiet. The settlement's canopy insects had paused their two-note exchange, as if the acoustic of the plaza had told them something large was being held in its shaped air. Sael spoke. Aishe translated, "Your people's account of the fifth son is the most accurate human record of what was done to your species." Tigo received it. He received it with his hands still, his back against the worn stone column, his eyes on Sael's face. She was not smiling. She was not offering comfort or congratulation. She was delivering a factual assessment with the same unhurried precision she had used for everything else. Your record was accurate. Other records were less accurate. This is what I am telling you. The plaza held the weight of it. The sun is still the sun, he thought. The fifth era is the era I am in. The God who made us did not look like what we pictured. That is always true of gods. What we picture is our capacity to picture, not their shape. We were seeing something real. We were seeing it from inside it, without the vocabulary of what it was. He was not destroyed by this. The confirmation that the five sons described a literal event, the transplanting of humans to their world, landed in him as reorientation. A shift in the angle of seeing, like the moment when you are high on the temple steps and the sun clears the eastern ridge and the shadow of the pyramid moves and you see the whole valley as a single design thing, not a collection of separate places. The cosmos survived the confirmation. Of course it did. A cosmology that had survived 400,000 years of oral transmission, imprecise, adapted, translated through every language his ancestors had spoken, was not a fragile thing. It was bedrock. You could pour new understanding on the bedrock, and the bedrock held. The new understanding found its place in the structure, and the structure accommodated it, because that was what structures that lasted did. I have spent my whole life inside a cosmology that describes something true without knowing it. This does not mean the cosmology was wrong. It means it was right in the way that all accurate records are right. They record the shape of what happened, not the mechanism. I am still inside the fifth sun. I am now outside the settlement of my birth, on a ship I took from a machine, speaking to someone who was watching my ancestors. The fifth and the sun is a stranger era than I thought. It is still my era. The Northman was watching him from the perimeter. His Sevhel face held something Tigo recognized, the expression of one man watching another man absorb a blow that would have broken a lesser structure, and seeing that the structure held. Sevhel gave a nod, just that, the acknowledgement of weight born. Quintus had his hand on the iron ring he wore. The Roman did this when he was processing something that connected to his own deep past. Tigo had noticed the gesture aboard the ship during the long watches. Quintus's face was still as worked stone, but his thumb moved against the ring in slow circuits. Hattori had not moved at all. That was his tell. When the strategist went perfectly still, he was mapping something new into the structure of what he already knew. Pakla had her eyes on the canopy, tracking the movement of the leaves as if reading weather. Her stillness was different from Hattori's. She had already absorbed the information and was now watching the terrain change around it. Then Deka stood up. Tigo watched her rise. She moved with the precise, controlled energy he had come to associate with her particular form of anger, structural, cold, patient. The anger of someone who had identified a system operating on her without her knowledge. He had seen the same quality in her aboard the ship when she had discovered that the Combine had been feeding them at 80% of what their bodies needed, calibrated to suppress resistance by exactly 31%. She had not shouted, she had not cursed, she had gone quiet, and then she had fixed it, and the fixing had been more frightening than any shout because it was precise. She was quiet now, standing, her hands loose at her sides, her weight balanced the way it balanced when she was about to say something she had been assembling for the entire duration of the conversation. Tigo recognized what was about to happen. Deka was going to ask the question he had not asked because he was oriented to the information differently. Tigo had heard the shape of the transplanting and recognized his cosmology in it. The shape was enough. The shape was in fact the primary thing. Why the gods had made the fifth son was a question that Tlemetni Blesmai addressed in the deeper teachings, and the answer was always the same, because the previous son had ended and something had to come next. The purpose was continuation. The mechanism was sacrifice. The result was the world. Deka did not have that framework. Deka had a different one, the framework of a woman who had spent her life identifying structures that operated on people without their consent, who diagnosed systems the way a healer diagnosed illness, by symptoms and vectors, and the question who benefits from this arrangement. She looked at Sael. What was the purpose? Denied that her voice was level. Clean. The combined words she chose were function intent, a logistics term, the kind of word that appeared in cargo manifest next to weight and destination. Why transplant humans? The question landed in the plaza like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan too felt it ripple outward through the group, through Aishe's stillness, through the slight shift in Quintus's posture, through the way Hattori's eyes moved fractionally to Sael's face. The Ikran at the edge of the plaza had gone very still. The youngest one's crest had risen, a slow unfurling of iridescent tissue that Tico had learned to associate with heightened attention. The air around the three of them felt thicker, charged. The third channel, the one Tico could sense but not decode, was active. Sael did not answer immediately. She regarded Deka with an expression Tico could not fully read, because Sael's face operated on a timescale different from theirs. Her expressions moved the way geological features moved, slowly, with enormous weight, arriving at their final form only after the observer had already begun to look away. Tigo watched her face and thought, this is a person who has had this conversation before, many times. She knows where the question comes, and she knows where the answer leads, and she has decided where to stop. That is the correct question, Sael said. Aishe translated. Her voice was very careful. Sael continued, and Aishe carried it across. I am not yet ready to answer it. Deka's jaw tightened. Just that, a flex of muscle beneath brown skin, the visible effort of accepting a boundary she had not agreed to. Tigo watched her weigh the options, push or wait. Deka was not impulsive. Her anger was patient. It could hold a shape for weeks and arrive at the correct moment with the force of something that had been gathering mass the entire time. She sat down. The plaza exhaled. Not literally, the canopy insects resumed their two-note calls. The filtered light continued its slow migration across the white stone. The broad leaves shifted in air that had not actually been holding its breath. But the felt quality of the space changed, the way a room changes after a door has been opened and then closed again without anyone passing through. The group dispersed, not all at once, in the gradual way a formation dissolves when no one gives the order to fall out, but everyone understands the work is done for now. Quintus exchanged a look with Hattori that was worth several sentences and left toward the Arvet. Sevhel rose, stretched. The sound his shoulders made was like two stones being rolled against each other, and took the path toward the settlement's water source, where Tigo had seen him go each evening, standing at the edge and looking at the distance as if measuring it against an older shore. Pakla simply vanished into the vegetation with the soundless economy she brought to all movement through any terrain. Deka paused beside Aishe. They spoke in low voices. Deka in the modern tongue Tigo did not understand, Aishe responding in the same, their exchange carrying the rhythm of two people who had established a communication channel that ran beneath the words. Deka's hand touched Aiza's shoulder briefly, then she left. Aiza looked at Tigo. Are you well? She asked, in the combine words. I am in the fifth son, Tigo said. Aiza studied him for a moment with the expression she wore when she was determining whether a statement required further translation or was complete as delivered. She decided it was complete. She nodded, gathered Sael's medical notes from the seat beside her, and followed Deka toward the shuttle. Tigo stayed, the plaza emptied of his people. Sael remained for a time, standing at the convergence of the two white paths, her face turned toward the system's pale star, where it angled through a gap in the canopy. Then she too left, walking not toward the settlement's interior, but toward its edge, where the cultivated growth gave way to something older and less shaped. She moved without hurry. Tigo watched her until the vegetation took her, and he thought, she has been walking to that edge for a very long time. He was alone in the plaza. He sat with the stone at his back and the filtered light on his hands, and he let the reorientation settle. It was not a fast process. The 5 suns had been the architecture of his understanding for every year of his life, learned before language was fully his, carried through the Kamikak, carried into the flower war, carried into the light that took him, carried through the cell and the ship and the silence. They were not shaken by Sael's account, they were confirmed by it, and confirmation, he was discovering, required its own kind of absorption. Because when a thing you believed is shown to be true, you must then live with the truth of it, which is heavier than the belief, because the truth has edges the belief only approximated. The gods who made the 5th sun did not look like Nano had seen. The fire they leapt into was not fire. The sacrifice that began the era was the end of an entire civilization, not the blood of gods at Teotihuacan. The mechanism was different. The scale was different. The vocabulary was different. But the shape was there. 4 endings, 1 creation from wreckage, humanity, surviving. His people had been seeing something real. They had been seeing it from inside it, with the tools they had, language, image, rhythm, the teacher's voice in the Quiquicali at dawn, and they had recorded what they saw. With the precision of people living inside the event, recording its shape through the only vocabulary available to them. That was what mythologies did. They recorded the shape of what happened, not the mechanism, and the shape endured. The afternoon light was shifting when the child appeared. Tigo had seen the child before, in the settlement's daily rhythms, moving among the Ikran and the settlement's human inhabitants with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had grown up in this place. A settlement child, small, dark-haired, brown-skinned, dressed in the settlement's simple woven fabric. The child's age was difficult to determine, young certainly, but with the watchful bearing of a child raised in a place where watching was the primary skill. The child did not approach directly. It circled the plaza's edge, pausing at intervals, the way a bird tests the perimeter of a new clearing before committing to the center. Tigo remained still. He had been still for a long time. He was good at stillness. The flower warriors trained it. The long waiting before the engagement, the body at rest, so the body could be fully in motion when the moment came. The child settled 2 arm lengths from him, close enough to be in the same space, far enough to leave. They did not share language. Tigo knew this the way he had come to know it with everyone aboard the ship, and in this settlement, the quick assessment of whether the other person's mouth could form the sounds your mouth formed, whether the rhythm of their speech carried any of the architecture of yours. The child's mouth did not. The child's language, when the child spoke, was something Tigo had no category for. The child began to speak. It was directed at Tigo. The child's eyes were on him. The child's body was oriented toward him, but the speech had the quality of something being performed rather than communicated. A recitation, a telling. The child's voice carried a melody that was not melody, a rhythm that was not the rhythm of any song Tigo recognized, and beneath it, around it, the air changed. Tigo felt it, a pressure that was not pressure, a thickening of the space between his skin and the world, as if the air itself had become a medium for something his body could register, but his mind could not name. It was the same thing he had felt at the edge of the Ikran reunion, the 3rd channel, the one Aishe had noted, the one the Ikrin used to communicate in a register humans could sense but not decode. The child was using all three channels. Voice, posture. The child's body held a specific shape, angled and deliberate, each joint carrying information the way Tigo's hands carried information when he described the 5 suns. And the third thing, the pressure in the air, the channel that was neither sound nor sight but occupied the space between them like the vibration of a drum you could feel through the floor without hearing the strike. Tigo did not understand any of it. He listened anyway. He listened the way the Tlamatanaim had taught him to listen to the oldest songs, the ones in the archaic Nahuatl that even the priests no longer fully parsed, the ones whose meaning lived in their shape rather than their words. You did not need to decode them. You needed to receive them. The shape carried what the words could not. The child spoke for a long time. The pale star moved. The shadows of the broad-leafed canopy tracked across the white stone in their slow arc. The two-note insects called and answered and called again. Tigo sat with his back against the worn column, and the third channel pressing against his awareness like the memory of a sound heard only through bone, and he thought, the 5th sun is a stranger era than I thought. The child fell silent. The air held its new density for a moment longer, then released slowly, like water settling after a stone has been dropped into it. The child looked at Tigo with clear, dark eyes that held no expectation of a response. Then the child rose, circled the plaza's edge in the same testing pattern, and was gone into the settlement. Igor remained. The light was failing. The two-note calls were thickening into their evening chorus, layering on top of each other, until the sound filled the shaped acoustic of the plaza, like water filling a vessel. He could feel, at the edge of his perception, the residual texture of whatever the child had been saying through the third channel, not the meaning, not the content, but the fact of it, that a communication had occurred in a register he could sense but could not read, that the world contained channels he had always been inside without knowing. I am still in it, he thought, the 5th sun, the era of movement, of earthquakes, begun by sacrifice, sustained by the cost of continuation. A full stranger than I pictured, larger, using vocabularies I did not know existed to describe itself. It is still my era. He sat with this for a long time, in the shaped plaza, in the fading light, while the air around him held the memory of something it had carried and he had not yet learned to hear. The morning air carried the settlement's warmth, warmth that had no source, light that had no angle. Quintus had stopped trying to identify the mechanism behind either. Whatever technology sustained this place was performing for no one's benefit, and examining it would not improve his capacity to make the decision that was, at this hour, approaching him on 2 legs. Sael found him on the path between the Arvith's landing position and the central plaza. She did not appear to have been waiting. She appeared to have been walking in the same direction at the same time, a coincidence that required planning. Aishe walked 3 steps behind Sael, hands loose at her sides, her expression the careful blankness she wore when she was translating between people who were each trying to say more than words could carry. She would like to walk with you, Aishe said. I can see that, Quintus said. Tell her she is welcome. They walked. The path curved through a stand of trees that resembled trees only loosely. The bark had the grain of wood, but the color shifted with the light, pale amber to deep bronze, and the leaves moved in rhythms that did not match the wind. The settlement's Ikrin were audible somewhere to the left, their 2-note morning calls layering into the acoustic shape of the canopy overhead. Pleasant, designed to be pleasant, which meant someone had designed it, and that was the thought Quintus kept returning to with this place. Every comfort here was a product of intention so old it had calcified into environment. Sael spoke. Her voice had the quality Quintus had come to associate with the keeper woman, unhurried, precise, as though each word had been selected from a larger set, and the ones she did not use were still visible behind the ones she chose. She spoke in whatever archaic Romani variant she and Aishe shared. and Aishe rendered it in the pidgin that had become the crew's working tongue. What this outpost does, Aishe translated, matching Sael's rhythm. We receive, we provide resources, we do not direct. Whatever you decide next is yours to decide. Quintus nodded. Sisanev, walking. The path opened into a clearing where water ran across shaped stone, a fountain, or something that served the purpose of a fountain. The water was clear and moved with a regularity that suggested mechanical assistance hidden beneath the stone. Sael continued. Aishe followed. I am telling you this because I want you to know that what the Covenant operative offers and what I offer are structurally different, and the difference is, I am not asking you to do anything. He stopped walking. The stop was precise. She had reached the point in the conversation she intended to reach, and she had reached the point on the path she intended to reach simultaneously. Quintus suspected she had calibrated the route to the length of the speech. He turned to face her. She met his eyes with the steady, clear regard he had seen from provincial governors who believed themselves to be neutral parties between competing factions. The governors were never neutral. Their neutrality was a position they occupied because it served their interests, and the fact that they believed otherwise was what made them dangerous. Sael was far older and far more capable than any provincial governor, but the structure was the same. Thank you, he said. He said it to Aishe, who would translate it to Sael, but he looked at Sael when he said it because the woman deserved the respect of his attention regardless of the language barrier. Sael inclined her head, a precise motion, acknowledging the acknowledgement. Then she walked past him, toward the plaza, and was gone among the bronze-bark trees with the unhurried pace of someone who had done what she came to do and was now finished. I woken in duathanic kanatpada and was now finished. Aishe remained. She means it, Aishe said, in the modern pidgin. She is not competing with whoever this other one is. She genuinely believes in what you told us. I know, Quintus said, but she also wanted to make sure you knew before you went in. I know that too. Aishe studied him with the look she wore when she was deciding how much of someone's interior state to name aloud. She decided against it. She nodded once, gave his forearm a brief squeeze, the Romany woman's version of a tactical briefing, and followed Sael's path toward the plaza. Quintus stood by the fountain and listened to the water and thought about what had just happened. That was the most political conversation I have had since leaving Rome. She told me nothing I did not already know and made me understand something I had not yet considered. That is a rare skill. I spent 30 years watching men in the Senate do it badly. The difference Sael had named between offering resources without direction and offering resources with a purpose was real. It was the difference between a supply depot and a recruiting station. Both provided food. One of them also provided a destination. He had an hour before the meeting with the Covenant operative. He spent it walking the settlement's perimeter, cataloging what he could see. The Ekran settlement dwellers moved through their routines, 40-odd beings with triple-jointed legs and scales that caught the ambient light and scattered it in fractured colors. They tended plots of vegetation he could not identify. They communicated in their layered way, voice, posture, and that third channel he could feel as pressure against his skin without being able to decode it. They were, as far as he could determine, content. 30 generations, Sael had said. This settlement had been here for 30 generations. The Ekran who lived here had been born here, raised here, had never known a combine cell or a freight manifest or the light that came through a containment field barrier. They were free in a way his people aboard the Arvath were not yet free, because his people still flinched at sounds that approximated the pitch of a combine alarm. 30 generations of receiving the freed and resourcing them, and then doing nothing else. Veth's message had arrived the morning after Hattori's identification, a communication through the settlement's internal system, not through Aishe or Sael. It had been addressed to Quintus by name in a script he recognized as the cursive abbreviation style used in Roman military dispatches. Not the formal Latin of senatorial correspondence, the field shorthand of a centurion's daily report that had been the first thing that told him something about the covenant operative. The second was that the message contained no terms, no argument, no preliminary positioning. It contained a time, a location, and a single sentence, a conversation at your convenience on a subject of mutual strategic interest. Military, direct, respectful of his time, the signature of someone who understood command culture from the inside, as a participant, not an observer. The hour passed. Quintus went to the meeting. The room was a working space on the settlement's eastern edge, small, low-ceilinged, with a wide window that looked out over the cultivated terraces. The light came in at an angle that illuminated the center of the room and left the edges in shadow. A practical space for a practical conversation. The covenant operative was already there. He stood by the window with his hands visible, a choice Quintus recognized. He was showing he was unarmed, because it communicated respect for the meeting's terms. He was wrong. That was the word Quintus's mind kept arriving at. Wrong in a way that was different from Saul's wrongness. Saul was wrong like a building that was too old to have been built by the people who lived in it. She was an anachronism, a thing that did not fit its context, but there was a stillness to her wrongness. She had been in one place for a long time, and the place had shaped itself around her. This man was wrong like a road that had been traveled too many times. The surface was smooth, but underneath it you could sense the compaction of 1,000 passages. His face was human, completely human, features that could have been Roman or Greek or Anatolian or any of the mixed peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. His skin was darker than Quintus's, the brown of someone who spent decades under stronger suns. His hair was cut short, his build was lean, the build of a man who moved frequently and carried what he needed and nothing else. His eyes were the problem. They were brown and clear and entirely too full of things. Quintus had seen haunted men, men who carried their dead like stones in their packs. This was different. This was a man who remembered everything he had seen, and he had seen a great deal, and the act of remembering had not diminished any of it. He spoke in Latin, not archaic Latin, not liturgical Latin, not the formal Latin of text that survived through centuries of copying. The Latin than Quintius's era, the military dialects, clipped vowels and swallowed endings that marked a man who had learned his grammar in a barracks rather than a schoolroom. The pronunciation was correct to within a generation of Quintius's own birth. Centurion, the operative said. The word carried the weight of a professional greeting between equals, an acknowledgement of rank and its implications. I don't know your rank, Quintus said. He kept his voice level. He was aware in the precise way of a man who had spent 30 years reading the men around him that this person was more dangerous than anything else on this settlement. I don't carry one. My name is Veth, Hattori's name for the shadow in the plaza. Quintus filed that the man had chosen to confirm the label the crew had given him rather than insist on a different one, a concession deliberate. I know what your people call me and I accept it. Then sit, Quintus said, and gestured at the low bench by the window. There were 2 benches, angled toward each other, with a flat surface between them that might have been a table. Quintus took the bench that put his back to the wall and his face to the door. They took the other without comment. For a moment neither spoke. The light from the window laid a bright trapezoid across the floor between them. Outside, the terraces caught the settlement's ambient glow, and the Ikrin moved through their morning patterns. Quintus could hear the layered 2-note calls, muffled by the walls. You addressed the message to me, Quintus said, not to Aishe, who is our speaker, not to Hattori, who identified you. To me, you are the one who will make the decision, Veth said. It was not a question. Quintus let it sit. What decision? Veth leaned forward slightly, engaged, not aggressive. The movement had the precision of someone who was aware of his own body language and chose each gesture for its effect, in the practiced way of someone who had spent so long communicating across cultures That deliberate physical clarity had become reflex. The continuance has been maintaining this waypoint for a long time, Vaith said. In that time, the combine's harvesting operations have not materially changed. Groups arrive, are resourced, move on. The combine adjusts its route slightly and continues. This outpost is not reducing the problem, it is managing the overflow. Quintus said nothing. He let the words land and measured them. The argument was clean, the logic was military. Assess the position, identify whether the current strategy was achieving its stated objective. State plainly that it was not. You disagree with what Sael does here, Quintus said. I disagree with what it accomplishes. What she does here, receiving the freed, providing for them, is good. I have no quarrel with the act. My quarrel is with the strategic logic that says this is sufficient. Quintus studied the man's face. Veth met his examination without flinching, without performing comfort. He simply sat and let himself be read. Tell me what you're offering, Quintus said. Veth nodded. Once a clean motion. 3 things. First, intelligence on the combine's frontier operations. Weaknesses, schedules, the administrators who manage the harvesting routes in this region. I have been tracking their operations for longer than this outpost has existed. I know where they are thin and where they are strong, and where the institutional gaps between Freight Command and the court create exploitable seams. Quintus felt his pulse pick up. Recognition. This was the language of a campaign briefing. He had sat in rooms like this before, with better maps and worse intelligence, and listened to men who knew the terrain describe the enemy's disposition. The cadence was the same. The stakes were different only in scale. Second, Veth continued, I know the locations of other freed cargo groups, ones large enough and organized enough to be contacted. Some are in the frontier, some are still in combine operational space hiding. Some don't know they could be found. Tanosil Gini combine operational space hiding. Some don't know they could be found. How many? 7 that I am confident of. 3 more that are probable. They range from 12 souls to nearly 1,000. Kissing Azord that. 7 groups, 3 probable. The Arveth carried approximately 660 people. If even half of those groups could be reached, he stopped the calculation. He was pricing a campaign he had not agreed to. And the third thing, he said. Veth paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man choosing how to frame something he had thought about for a long time. You have a ship, Veth said. You have 600 people who know what the inside of a combine harvest vessel looks like. You have a credible operation that the combine has no file on. That combination has not existed in the frontier in my memory. I am asking you to use it. The room was quiet. Outside an Ikrin called, a single, rising note that found no answering second voice. You are asking us to go back toward the combine, Quintus said. I am asking you to consider that going back toward the combine is the only strategic action that changes the situation. Everything else, staying here, moving deeper into the frontier, building a settlement, is holding. Holding is defensible. I am not dismissing it, but holding assumes the combine will decline on its own, and in 10,000 years of observation, it has not declined. It has not grown either. It has continued. The bureaucracy perpetuates itself because nothing has ever given it a reason to stop, and we would be that reason. You would be the beginning of one. Quintus turned the ring on his finger. The iron service ring, worn smooth by 30 years of wearing, the metal dark with the oils of his skin. He turned it once, twice, a habit from the old life. The ring turned when he was thinking, and the men who had served under him had learned to read the speed of the turning as a gauge of how fast his mind was moving. I will consider this, Quintus said. Vaith's expression did not change. He had expected this answer. The fact that he had expected it and had still made the argument with full conviction, rather than holding back for a second round, told Quintus something about the man. I've been here 6 months, Veth said. I will be here when you are ready. In Ulysses, the motion was clean and unhurried, a man who was finished and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Your Latin," he said, "3rd century of your city's founding, Eastern garrison. Your commander was," he named the name Quintus had not heard spoken aloud in what felt like a lifetime, the correct name, the correct pronunciation. Then Veth was gone, and Quintus was alone in the room with the light and the silence and the knowledge that a man who had been observing the Combine for longer than this outpost had existed had just asked him to take his ship and his people back into the machine that had harvested them. He sat for a long time. The light moved across the floor. The trapezoid narrowed, lengthened, shifted toward the eastern wall. The sounds of the settlement filtered in, Ikren calls, the movement of water across shaped stone, voices in languages he did not speak. I have seen generals press advantage, and I have seen generals hold. Both have their place. What I am calculating now is the cost of pressing. We go back toward the Combine. Some of us don't come back. We free people who would not otherwise be freed. We become, in the Combine's records, something they have a file on. Those are the costs. I am not dismissing the offer. I am pricing it. The cost of holding was what Veth had said. A generation of freed cargo passes through this outpost and moves on into the frontier. The Combine adjusts its routes by a fraction of a degree and continues harvesting. Nothing changes. The machine runs. The cost of pressing was blood, his people's blood, the blood of 600 souls who had already bled in Combine cells and had earned, by any measure he knew, the right to stop bleeding. But the 7 groups, the 3 probable, the 1,000 souls who did not know they could be found. He turned the ring. The position supports it. The intelligence is credible. The man is credible, not trustworthy, not yet, but credible. He is not lying about the Combine's disposition or the strategic opportunity. His lying would not serve his purpose. He needs us to act on accurate information or the action fails, and a failed action serves no one. He is a general who wants to press advantage. I know this species of man. I served under 3 of them. 2 won their campaigns. 1 did not. The difference was not in the quality of the argument. All 3 had correct strategic logic. The difference was in the cost they were willing to impose on the men who followed them. Veth is willing to impose the cost, and he was honest about that. He did not hide it. The question is whether I am willing to accept it. He did not have the answer yet. The ring turned and did not stop. Hattori was where Quintus expected him to be, on the Arvith's observation deck, which offered a view of the settlement below and the star field above. The strategist sat with his back to the bulkhead and his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees in the posture Quintus had come to recognize as his thinking position. Aishe sat nearby, cross-legged on the deck plating, rewrapping a length of cloth around her forearm, a habit she returned to when her hands needed occupation. He looked up when Quintus entered and read his face in a glance. "You met him," she said. "I met him. Evandarim." Quintus sat. The deck was cold. The Arvaith environmental systems ran efficient but not generous, and the observation deck was the least insulated space on the ship. He felt the chill through the fabric of his clothes and welcomed it. Cold sharpened thought. He told them what Veth had offered. He laid it out in order, the intelligence, the contacts, the argument, without inflection, without his assessment. He wanted Hattori's rid before he colored it with his own. Aishe translated for Hattori, her voice low and steady, matching Quintus's pace. When she finished, the observation deck was quiet. The star field turned slowly beyond the viewport. Not actually turning, Deka had explained, but the settlement's rotation creating the illusion of movement. The stars were still. Everything else moved around them. Hattori was silent for a long time. His eyes were closed. His breathing was even. Quintus had learned that this was not meditation, it was processing. The strategist was mapping the argument, looking for the structure underneath the words, testing it against what he knew. Then he opened his eyes and spoke. Aishe caught it. held it in the space between languages, and delivered it. He is not wrong. Longwo, 3 words. Quintus felt the weight of them settle. No, Quintus said, he isn't. Hattori spoke again, more this time, a string of precise syllables that Aishe rendered with care. But a man can be correct in his logic and still be offering you a knife that cuts in both directions. The question is not whether the argument holds. The question is what happens to the people who carry it out. That is what I am pricing, Quintus said. Hattori looked at him. The strategist's gaze was the most direct thing about him. Everything else was oblique, measured, approached from angles. But when he looked directly at you, the full weight of a man who had survived Sengoku politics sat behind those eyes. He spoke one more sentence. Aishe translated, "This is not a decision for 2 people on a cold deck." Wintat nodded slowly. He had known this before Hattori said it. He had known it in the room with Veth, and before that on the path with Sael, and before that in the message that had arrived addressed to him specifically, Wintes Centurion, the man who decided. For 30 years of military life, that had been the structure, he decided. Others followed. The weight sat on his shoulders because that was where it belonged, but he was not a centurion anymore. He was one of 7 people on the ship that 6 of those people had named, carrying 600 souls that all of them were responsible for, and the decision Veth was asking them to make would determine whether those 600 souls went deeper into safety or turned back toward the machine. And that was not his decision alone. He called them together at dusk. The settlement had fire. It was the first open flame Quintus had seen since Earth, real fire, burning in a stone-lined pit at the center of the plaza, casting orange light that moved and flickered in ways that the settlement's ambient glow never did. The Ikran kept their distance from it. The fire was for the humans. Sael had arranged it, or someone had arranged it, and the gesture, "These creatures need this particular thing," was another piece of evidence that the keepers had been watching for a very long time. 7 humans in firelight. Quintus, Sevhel, who sat with his forearms on his knees and the firelight catching the scar tissue on his hands. Hattori, straight-backed, his shadow falling long and still behind him. Pakla, who had chosen the position with the widest sight line and sat there with the alertness of someone who never fully stopped scanning terrain. Tigo, cross-legged, his face in the middle distance, the new interior quiet that had settled over him since the plaza conversation with Sael. Aishe sitting between Hattori and Deka because she always sat where the most translation work was needed. Deka, who had a piece of the Arvith's hull plating in her lap that she was turning over in her hands, her mind visibly running parallel processes behind her eyes. And the Ichana representative, the eldest of the 3 from the Arvith, who had earned a seat at this council by virtue of having been in the cells alongside them. The eldest sat slightly apart, iridescent scales catching the firelight in patterns that rippled with each of the 2-note calls still sounding from the settlement behind them. The segmented eyes reflected the flames as a dozen small, shifting fires. Quintus stood. The others looked at him. He felt the weight of the attention the way he had always felt it, as obligation. These people were listening because they trusted him to say something worth hearing. "Today I met with the Covenant operative," he said. Sudivam began to translate, her voice running under his like a second current in the same river. "He offered us intelligence on Combine operations. He offered us the locations of other groups, freed cargo, like us who might be contacted. And he asked us to take the Arvith back toward Combine space." He laid out Veth's argument. He did it cleanly, without editorializing, the way he would have presented an enemy disposition to his officers in the old life. Here are the forces, here is the terrain, here is the opportunity, here is the risk. Then he laid out Sael's position, which was not a position so much as an absence of one. The continuance receives, it provides, it does not direct. That too was a strategy of patience, of long timelines, of absorbing the Combine's overflow without confronting the Combine itself. "Neither is wrong," Quintus said. "Both have costs." And Hattori sat down. The fire cracked. A log shifted. Orange sparks rose into the air above the plaza and were lost against the alien sky. Silence. 6 languages and many silences. Quintus watched them, Sevhel's jaw working, the big man chewing on the problem, the way he chewed on everything, with his whole body engaged. Pakla's eyes tracking the fire's movement the way she tracked everything, looking for the pattern. Tigo motionless, listening to something no one else could hear. Deka turned the hull plating over in her hands one more time. Then she looked up. How good is his intelligence? The question was practical. It was the right first question. Quintus answered it. The firelight moved. The conversation began halting, translated, looping through Aishe and back, with gaps where languages did not map and silences where they did. Sevhel spoke once, bluntly. Hattori spoke twice, precisely. The Kankle asked about the route. Ido asked about the people who were waiting. The Ikran eldest made a sound, a low, resonant tone that the fire's crackle could not mask. The sound carried something in the third channel, something Quintus felt against his skin like a change in air pressure. Aishe listened, her head tilted, and then translated not the words but the shape of them. We remember the cells. We remember who opened them. The fire burned. The deliberation continued. Quintus sat in it, turning his ring, watching the faces of the people he was responsible for as they weighed what it would cost to go back toward the thing that had taken them. In 30 years of military life, I made my own decisions. I am waiting on this one. I do not know yet if that is wisdom or cowardice. The fire threw long shadows across the plaza stones. The sparks rose. The conversation wound through its many languages and its many silences, and the decision approached, not arrived, not yet, but approaching, like a tide that had already turned somewhere out of sight and was now, inevitably, making its way toward shore. The manifest was wrong. It had been wrong since the day Deka first opened it. A cargo log, formatted in combined freight notation, 663 entries, organized by the only categories the Combine cared about: species, acquisition point, commercial classification, projected yield. She had used it anyway because it was the only head count she had, and in those first frantic days aboard the Arveth, knowing how many mouths needed feeding mattered more than what the document called them. 20 days later, crouched at the secondary engineering console she had claimed as her own, Deka stared at the headers and felt the slow burn of something she had been too busy to feel before. Projected yield. She'd seen documents like this in Mogadishu. The Combine had a sharper gift for reducing people to freight metrics, but the shape was the same. Displacement reports, refugee tallies. A human being became a line item. The line item became a budget allocation, and the budget allocation became a decision made by someone who had never met the human being and never would. She knew the shape of this. She'd worked inside it. She also knew what happened when you let it stand. Deka closed the cargo log, opened a new file. The Arva systems accepted the input with the same indifferent hum they gave everything. The ship did not care what its crew wrote, only that someone was writing. She set her cursor at the top of the blank document and typed to the first header. Name, given or preferred. The cursor blinked. She typed the second, species. Third, ERA of origin. Fourth, languages, spoken. Fifth, skills, identified. She paused on the sixth. The Combine's manifest had a header. Commercial classification. She spent 30 seconds deciding what to put in its place. She put, skills, self-reported. The difference between those two headers was the entire argument. The manifest was one of several things that needed doing today. Today was departure day, and departure day meant Deka was operating on 4 tracks simultaneously. The way she had learned to in Mogadishu, crises did not have the courtesy to arrive one at a time. Track 1, navigation data. Vesta's intelligence package sat on a separate partition Deka had isolated from the Arvis main systems because she trusted the Covenant operative approximately as far as Sevhel could throw him, and Sevhel could throw most things an impressive distance, but probably not a man who moved without ships. The data was clean as far as she could tell. Combined frontier route maps, patrol frequencies, the harvest operation scheduled in 40 days, one vessel, a cargo count that suggested a recently taken group, not yet processed, not yet broken down into projected yield. She cross-referenced Veth's routes against Pakla's charts, where Pakla's hand-annotated star patterns matched Veth's data. Deka flagged the route segments green, where they diverged amber, where they contradicted red. The result was a navigation corridor that looked like a bruise, green at the center, amber at the edges, red in the gaps. Pakla would want to walk it herself before they committed. Good. Deka wanted her to walk it. Track 2, food synthesis. The Arvith was taking on new crew, 4 additional Ikran, bringing the total to 7. 2 members of a species Aishe had made contact with during the outpost stay, whose metabolic profiles Deka did not yet have. And one figure she had not expected, the child from the plaza, the one who had approached Higo on the night Sael told them about the transplanting. The child's guardian had decided the Arveth was where the child should go next. Sael had neither encouraged nor prevented this, which was Sael's way of saying everything by saying nothing. Aishe pulled up the synthesis matrix. 41 of 47 parameters active, output at 105% baseline. She had headroom. The Ikran metabolic profiles she could estimate from the 3 already aboard. The Vesa eldest had been meticulous about communicating dietary needs through Aishe's pigeon, and the data extrapolated well. The 2 new species members were a different problem. Aishe had sent her a set of notes in the mixed notation system they had developed, half combine operational vocabulary, half improvised shorthand. Deka parsed them, built provisional synthesis profiles, flagged them for adjustment after the first 48 hours of observed intake. The child was the simplest problem and the strangest, a human child, raised at a keeper outpost for an indeterminate number of years, eating food that had been grown in soil that predated the combine's existence. Deka set the child's synthesis profile to standard human baseline and annotated it, adjust per observation. Aishe, track 3, head count. She went through the cargo manifest one final time, the combine's manifest, the old one, the wrong one, 663 entries when she had first opened it, 63 freed captives, and approximately 600 in the original cargo holds. Since then, the captain was departing, reducing the combine personnel to the slaver alone. 4 Ikran joining, 2 new species crew, 1 child. She ran the numbers, updated the total, and then, for the last time, closed the combine's file. She would not open it again. Track 4, the manifest. Deka started with herself, name given or preferred, Deka, species human, transplant stock, ERA of origin 2019 CE Gregorian, languages spoken Somali, English, Arabic, conversational, combine operational, functional, skills identified, systems analysis, electrical engineering, field medicine, crisis logistics, food synthesis programming, navigation mathematics, first contact protocol development. The skills Mona self-reported, generator repair, keeping people fed, asking the next question when the current answer is insufficient. She looked at it. The self-reported column was shorter than the identified column. That felt right. The things you claimed about yourself should weigh less than the things others saw you do. She saved the entry and went to find the crew. Sevhel was in the forward cargo hold, doing something to a bulkhead panel that involved sustained force and what Deka had come to recognize as his working expression. Jaw set, eyes focused at a point approximately 3 centimeters behind whatever he was looking at, as though he could see the stress grain inside the material. Which, given his track record with combine composites, maybe he could. I'm building a crew manifest, Deka said. She had learned to open conversations with Sevhel by stating what she was doing. He responded to function. I need your entry. Sevhel looked up. His hands did not stop working the panel. What goes in it? Name, species, where you're from, when you're from, what languages you speak, what you're good at, what I've seen, and what you say. The big Norseman considered this for approximately 2 seconds, which was longer than he gave most things. Skills, he said. Skills. He wiped his hands on his thighs, the gesture of a man accustomed to grease and salt water and the residue of work. Raid coordination, he said. Ship navigation, coastal, long sea, knot work, ice travel, open water endurance, close combat, several weapons, livestock assessment, some carpentry, reading weather, reading men. The Deka typed. She got through livestock assessment and paused. Reading men, Sevhel's mouth twitched toward a smile. You read machines, I read people. Whether a man will hold a line, whether he'll run, where the weak joint is in a crew before the crew knows it has one. He shrugged, the motion of a man who had been doing this since he was old enough to pull an oar. Useful on a ship. Oh, useful on a ship. Deka agreed. She typed reading men in the self-reported column, and the entry was the longest on the manifest so far, and none of it was frivolous. Quintus gave his entry with Roman precision. Name, rank, former, languages, Latin, Camp Greek, operational combine, functional crew pigeon, skills, unit organization, defensive planning, logistics, morale discipline, long march endurance. When Deka asked for self-reported skills, he paused, the first time she had seen him pause for a personal question. Command, he said finally, not the planning, the other thing, the part where you must decide and the decision will cost someone. Deka typed it. The cursor blinked. She did not ask him to elaborate. Hattori's entry was the most carefully worded. He dictated it through Aishe, not because he could not communicate directly, but because he wanted the nuance preserved. His skills identified column included intelligence analysis, pattern recognition in hierarchical systems, behavioral camouflage, silent movement, close quarters neutralization. His self-reported column was a single line, the question that changes the terms of the negotiation. Pakla stood by the navigation console and gave her entry without looking at Deka. She spoke to the star charts while she spoke, her fingers tracing the route segments Deka had flagged. Tracking, terrain reading, any terrain including this one. A gesture at the void outside the hull. Horse management, but there are no horses. Long distance travel under pursuit. Finding water. She paused, knowing when the ground is about to change before it changes. Deka typed it all. Pakla never turned around, and neither of them pretended this was anything less than what it was, a woman defining herself in the absence of the land that had defined her. Aishe's entry took longer because Aishe kept trying to translate other people's contributions more precisely instead of giving her own. Deka had to ask 3 times. Finally, Aishe sat across from her and spoke in the register she used when she was being honest rather than diplomatic. Languages. Romani, Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian, combine operational and formal, Ukraine pidgin, partial Vetsa vocalization, medical care, wound treatment, herbal pharmacology from a tradition that does not exist here but the principles carry. Translation. Mediation. She stopped. Reading a room before the room knows it needs reading. Self-reported. Anisha's expression shifted. Guarded warmth. The one Deka had come to understand was her real face, the one under the diplomatic mask, keeping people talking to each other when they want to stop. Tigo was sitting cross-legged in the corridor outside the bridge, which was where he sat when he was thinking. Deka lowered herself to the deck beside him and explained the manifest. He listened with his characteristic stillness, the focused attention of a man for whom listening was a tactical act. Era of origin, he said. When you're from. The calendar year. Tigo's eyes moved to a point in the middle distance. My people did not count years the way your calendar counts them. We counted the movements of the world, the sun, the completion of a cycle. Deka waited. She had learned that Tigo's pauses were the space he made for the right words to arrive. I was taken in the year 1 reed, he said. In your counting, I am told it is 1487, but era of origin asks me to define when I am from by a system that is not mine. He looked at her. Put the year your calendar gives. Then put age of the fifth sun, the era of movement. Both are true. The manifest should hold both. Deka typed it, ERI of origin, 1487 CE Gregorian, age of the fifth sun, Nahui Olin, the era of movement. When she looked up, Tigo was watching her with an expression she could not read. Skills, we said. Combat, he said. Ritual and tactical, they are the same thing, if the ritual is honest. Observation, endurance past the point where the body says to stop. Knowledge of astronomy, practical, not decorative. The discipline of offering what you have without negotiating the price. She typed it, and the last line sat on the screen like a philosophy disguised as a skill, and she left it. The child was last. Deka found them in the settlement plaza, standing near the fire pit where the deliberation had happened 2 nights ago. The ashes were cold. The child was watching a group of Ikrin load supplies onto a pallet with the focused attention of someone memorizing a process. Aishe stood beside Deka, ready to translate. What do you know how to do? Deka asked. The child turned, looked at Deka with eyes that were entirely human and entirely unreadable. Then the child did something Deka had seen twice before, once when the child approached Tigo, once in passing on the settlement's paths. Though the child's mouth formed words in what might have been archaic Ikrin, or something older, and simultaneously something moved in the space between them, a pressure, a shape, a communication on the third channel that Deka could feel against her skin but could not parse. It tilted her head, listened with her whole body. After a moment, she spoke. The child says, growing things, finding things that are lost, listening to what is underneath. Deka typed it into the manifest exactly as given. Name, the child had offered a name through Aishe, a sound that Deka rendered phonetically as Kel. Species, human, keeper outpost, frontier raised, ERA of origin, unknown, born at the outpost, languages, archaic Ikrin, third channel partial, skills, self-reported, growing things, finding things that are lost, listening to what is underneath. The entry looked strange next to the others, a child's self-knowledge against the accumulated expertise of warriors and survivors and engineers. But it was the only entry on the manifest where the self-reported column held everything and the identified column was blank, and Deka realized with a jolt that this was the purest form of the document's argument. The child had agreed to be seen. No one had assessed the child first. The manifest took 3 hours. It filled 4 screens. Every person aboard the Arveth who could be reached through direct conversation, through Aishe's translation, through the Ikrin pidgin, through the halting gestural exchanges Deka had learned to conduct with the 2 new species crew, had an entry. The entries varied in length, from Sevhel's exhaustive accounting to entries that held only a name and a single skill offered through 2 layers of translation by someone who had been cargo 12 hours ago and had never been asked what they were good at. Deka printed it. The Arvith's fabrication systems could produce physical documents, a capability she had never used because until now there had been nothing worth committing to a form that could be held. The printer hummed. The sheets emerged warm. She held them and felt their weight, which was negligible, and their significance, which was immense. Sael was in the plaza. She stood where she always stood, near the center, where the sight lines converged, where you could see the settlement's paths radiating outward, and the sky above and the ground below simultaneously. The light was the outpost's perpetual gold, the color of a sun that behaved like a sun but was, Deka suspected, something else entirely. Deka approached with a printed manifest in her hands. Aishe walked at her left shoulder. Sael watched them come. Her face held the expression Deka had learned to recognize as attention, older than warmth or coldness. The attention of a woman whose lineage predated every civilization that had produced the people now aboard a stolen ship in her sky. Deka held out the manifest. Sael took it. She read it the way Deka had seen her read everything, slowly, with a stillness that made the air around her heavier. She turned each page. Her eyes moved across the names, the eras, the skills. She paused on Tigo's entry. She paused on the child's. The silence stretched. The plaza's ambient sounds, distant voices, the rustle of settlement activity, the hum that might have been wind or might have been something else, filled the space around two women standing over a document. Then Sael spoke. Her words moved through Aishe's translation like water through stone, shaped by the channel but carrying their own force. The Combine's manifest was what it thought you were. This one is what you are. Deka looked at the manifest in Sael's hands. The pages, the headers, the names, mine. Yes, she said. Sael handed it back. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the last page for a fraction of a second, a contact so brief Deka almost missed it. Then the manifest was in Deka's hands again, and Sael stepped back, and the moment closed like a door that had been opened just long enough. Then Sael walked away toward the interior of the settlement and did not look back. The captain walked off the Arveth for the last time in the middle afternoon. Deka watched from the cargo ramp. Quintus stood at the foot of it in what she recognized, after 20 days of proximity, as his formal posture, feet at shoulder width, spine straight, chin level, hands at his sides. The iron ring on his finger caught the outpost's golden light. The captain descended the ramp with the gait of a being who had walked the ship's corridors for 41 years and knew the precise distance between every surface. He carried nothing. He had requested nothing to take. The outpost would provide, or it wouldn't, and either way he was no longer aboard a vessel that had stopped being his the moment Sevhel's fist found the cell wall's stress grain. Quintus did not thank him. He did not apologize. Instead, he did something Deka had never seen, a short, precise gesture that began at his chest and ended at his hip, accompanied by 3 words in Latin that she caught only fragments of. A Roman military ceremony, the formal end of an attached service, acknowledgement that a period of mutual obligation had concluded. The captain watched this without understanding it. His segmented eyes, the kaleidoscope facets that Deka had learned to read for mood, though she was never certain she was reading correctly, held steady on Quintus's face. He understood its quality. He nodded once. The motion was small and alien and entirely recognizable. Then he turned and walked toward the settlement, his triple-jointed legs finding the outpost's paths with the same precision they had found the ship's corridors, and he did not look back. Winty Sauvage, him go mess until advanced the first line of structures, and then Quintus turned and climbed the ramp, and his face held nothing that Deka could name, and she did not ask. The slaver was in the aft maintenance bay when the cargo ramp sealed. Though Deka knew because she had checked his location on the internal sensors, a habit she had developed in the first week and would not be giving up. He was performing repairs on the secondary atmospheric processor, which had developed a harmonic whine 3 days ago, that the slaver had diagnosed as a cascade fault in the pressure equalization system. He was staying. He had not been given the option of leaving. Deka noted his continued presence in the manifest. Name, species, combine, unspecified. ERA of origin N/A. Languages, combine, formal and operational. Limited crew pigeon. Skills identified. Ship systems repair. Cargo management. Xenobiological assessment. Skills, self-reported. The slaver had not been asked. The self-reported column was blank, and was the only blank entry in the document. Deka left it that way. Consent was the architecture, and the slaver had not consented to be here. When he did, if he did, the column would fill. The Arveth's Engine cycled to departure frequency at hour 16. Deka stood at the nav display. Behind her, the bridge was full. The word mattered. When she had first stood here, in the early hours after the breakout, the bridge had been a stolen room full of people who did not know what any of the surfaces did. The sound had been uncertain, breaths held, movements tentative, the ambient hum of a ship that knew its operators were unqualified. Now Pakla stood at the navigation console, her hands resting on the interface with the easy familiarity of someone who had made this space her terrain. The star charts beneath her fingers were annotated in 3 notations: combined cartographic, Pakla's own observational marks, and Veth's intelligence overlay, which Deka had color-coded green, amber, red. Hattori occupied the communication station. He had learned its architecture the way he learned everything, by watching it, by mapping its patterns, by understanding what it wanted before he asked it for anything. The station's displays showed the Arvith broadcast profile, independent trader, absent from any combined database, a ship that did not exist in the bureaucracy's records. Sevhel held his position at the tactical display, a station the Combine had designed for monitoring cargo compliance, and which Sevhel had repurposed for threat assessment, with the blunt intuition of a man who had survived by reading the sea for danger. And humanity-vs-alien-overlords, self-reported, reading weather, reading men, both applied here. Tigo stood at the bridge's perimeter watching. His role in the bridge rotation was observation, the overhead view, the pattern that no one at a console could see because they were inside it. He had called it the Eagle's position through Aishe's translation, and no one had questioned it, because Tigo's capacity to see what was actually happening had been proven too many times to argue with. Aishe was between stations, which was where she belonged, the connective tissue, the translator, the one who heard what each person said and what they meant, and negotiated the distance between the two. The Ikaren eldest stood near her, communicating in the 3-channel mode that Deka could feel on her skin but could not decode. Behind them, 2 of the new Ikaren crew occupied positions at secondary consoles, their triple-jointed fingers moving with increasing confidence across interfaces that had been built by their captors and were now, improbably, theirs. Quintus stood at the command position. His iron ring caught the console light. He did not speak. He waited. Deka looked at the nav display. The chart showed the frontier route, Veth's intelligence, Pakla's annotations, the 40-day window, the harvest operation, 1 combine vessel, a cargo count that suggested people who had been recently taken and not yet broken down into projected yield. The 3rd version of this image. The first time she had stood here, the galaxy had been an incomprehensible map of a place she did not know, full of symbols she could not read, aboard a ship she did not understand, surrounded by people she could not speak to. She had been afraid. The 2nd time she had annotated the chart herself. Pakla's routes, the Ikran intelligence, the avoided cluster that turned out to hold the settlement below. The galaxy had become a place with paths, and the paths had been partly hers. She had been less afraid and more angry. Now the chart was annotated in 6 hands. The bridge held a crew at every station. The heading was toward a specific place, at a specific time, for a specific reason, chosen by a group of people who had sat around the fire and voted. The Combine doesn't have a file on the Arvith, Deka thought. It does not have files on any of the people on this ship. We have been free of that database for 30 days. I am building a different database. The difference is, everyone on this ship agreed to be in mine. Set course, Quintus said. Deka's fingers found the nav display. The heading locked. The outpost fell away below them, gold and green and impossible, growing smaller in the external display until it was a point of warm light in the black, and then a memory, and then a place they had been and would carry. The Arvith climbed. The frontier opened ahead of them, unmapped except where they had mapped it, dangerous and chosen. On the secondary screen at Deka's left elbow, the manifest glowed. 671 entries, names, languages, skills given and claimed. The Combine's cargo log was closed and would not be reopened. In its place, a document, There was an argument, written in data, that the people inside it were people, and that someone had asked them, and that they had answered. The stars ahead were the Combine stars. For now, the Arveth went to meet them.